Long before Rome raised its stone walls and reached eternal glory, the Italian peninsula was a fragmented territory, populated by distinct cultures and marked by external influences coming from across the Mediterranean. At the beginning of the first millennium before Christ, this region was a crossroads where various peoples coexisted, competed, and exchanged knowledge. Among the Apennine Mountains, the fertile plains, and the rugged coastlines, different tribes spread out and shaped what would later become the fertile ground for the emergence of Roman civilization. The Latins, located in Latium, lived in simple agricultural villages with a community structure based on the family. To the north were the Etruscans, one of the most enigmatic cultures of antiquity, with strong Eastern influence, sophisticated art, and an advanced urban political system that would strongly inspire the Romans. To the west, along the coast and the nearby islands, Greek colonists founded prosperous cities such as Cumae and Tarentum, bringing their language, philosophy, and myths to the peninsula. In the south, Italic peoples such as the Samnites and the Lucanians inhabited mountainous regions and were constantly at war with each other, while in the interior there were smaller nuclei of Umbrians and Sabines. Each of these groups had its own religion, dialect, and lifestyle, yet they were interconnected through trade networks that crossed land and sea. The landscape of this era was a boiling cultural mosaic. The Phoenicians, navigators from the east, established contacts along the coast and introduced luxury goods such as textiles and metals, leaving their mark on navigation and commerce techniques. The mines in the northern peninsula attracted foreign interest and made it possible to forge bronze and iron weapons and tools, something that would change the way the tribes fought and built. The Etruscans, in particular, were responsible for a remarkable urban flourishing, with fortified cities, rudimentary roads, and a drainage system that made it possible to control flooded areas. Their artistic and religious influence was decisive. They introduced symbols, rites, and practices that would later be absorbed and transformed by the Romans. Etruscan writing, derived from the Greek alphabet, also played a crucial role in the formation of the Latin alphabet that would consolidate in the centuries to come. This diversity of peoples and cultures created a complex and rich foundation on which Rome would emerge as a center of absorption and transformation. The geography of the peninsula played a vital role in this process. The mountain ranges provided protection, but also isolation. The fertile valleys allowed abundant harvests. Rivers such as the Tiber served as natural routes for the movement of people and goods. This central position in the Mediterranean turned the peninsula into a kind of bridge between East and West, between older cultures and the new societies that were forming. Thus, when Rome was born, it did not emerge in a vacuum but in an environment saturated with traditions that it knew how to copy, adapt, and surpass, gradually becoming the political, military, and cultural center that would change the destiny of the ancient world. Long before the Romans recorded their own history, they created for themselves an origin story shrouded in myth, a link that connected their city to the epic prestige of the most famous war of the ancient world, the Trojan War. This connection was established through the figure of Aeneas, the Trojan hero described in Homer's poems and later immortalized by Virgil in the epic Aeneid. According to tradition, Aeneas, son of the goddess Venus and the mortal Anchises, escaped the destruction of Troy carrying his elderly father on his shoulders and holding the hand of his son Ascanius, while behind him the city burned, devastated by the Achaeans. This powerful and symbolic image shows a man carrying on his shoulders the weight of the past, but walking toward a new future. Fleeing with a small group of survivors, Aeneas sailed across the Mediterranean, faced storms, visited the mythical city of Carthage, lived a romance with Queen Dido, and guided by a destiny set by the gods, finally reached the lands of the Italian peninsula. The legend says that upon landing in the region of Latium, Aeneas encountered local tribes, and after conflicts and alliances, married Lavinia, the daughter of the Latin king. The union of a Trojan prince with an Italic princess symbolized the fusion of two worlds and established the lineage that generations later would lead to the birth of Romulus and Remus. Ascanius, also called Iulus, founded the city of Alba Longa, and from this city the royal bloodline would continue until the birth of the twins. This invented genealogy served as an ideological pillar. Rome would not be just a new city, but the direct heir to the culture and greatness of Troy. This myth offered the Romans a sense of mission and destiny, the conviction that they had been chosen by the gods to rule and bring order to the world, just as Aeneas had been chosen to survive and rebuild a new homeland. Beyond the myth itself, it is important to understand the political and cultural significance of this narrative. By connecting itself to Troy, Rome placed itself in the line of succession of one of the most renowned traditions of the Mediterranean, while at the same time distinguishing itself from neighboring peoples. This story also provided a religious basis to justify Roman expansion. The Romans saw themselves as descendants of a hero who had suffered, survived, and been guided by the divine, and therefore they believed they had the obligation to fulfill a greater destiny. Centuries later, this myth was masterfully developed by Virgil during the reign of Octavian Augustus, when the empire needed a solid founding narrative. The Aeneid transformed the journey of Aeneas into an example of Roman virtue: courage, discipline, faith in the gods, and willingness to sacrifice for the sake of the future. Thus, the myth of Aeneas ceased to be just a legend and became a powerful tool of social cohesion and political legitimization, defining from the very beginning that Rome was not born by chance, but under the weight of a destiny traced by the heavens. Among all the stories surrounding the origin of Rome, none is more symbolic and striking than the legend of the twins Romulus and Remus. It combines elements of destiny, violence, family, and perseverance, creating a narrative that, more than explaining a foundation, conveys the mindset that would shape the Roman character. Tradition says that the two brothers were direct descendants of Aeneas through the royal lineage of Alba Longa. The throne of that city was usurped by Romulus, who, fearing rivals, ordered the death of all the descendants of the legitimate king and condemned his niece Rhea Silvia to serve as a vestal, a priesthood that demanded chastity. However, Mars, the god of war, fell in love with Rhea Silvia, and from this union the twins were born. To eliminate the threat they represented, Romulus ordered that they be thrown into the Tiber River, but destiny intervened. The current carried them to a riverbank where they were found by a she-wolf who nursed and protected them in a cave known as the Lupercal. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus found the children and, together with his wife, raised them as his own. When they reached youth, Romulus and Remus discovered their true origins and avenged themselves on the usurper, restoring the throne to their grandfather. They then decided to found a new city in the place where they had been saved. But unity soon gave way to discord. The brothers could not agree on which hill to build the city, and they resorted to omens, waiting for signs from the gods. Remus was the first to see 6 vultures flying in the sky, while Romulus claimed to have seen 12, which led to a dispute over who had been chosen by the gods. In the heat of the conflict, Romulus killed Remus, according to the most famous version, after Remus mocked the new walls by leaping over them. Thus, in an act of fratricide, the city of Rome was born in the year traditionally fixed at 753 before Christ. This violent act became a founding mark. From its very origin, Rome showed that its history would be made of blood, ambition, and determination. Behind the legend, modern archaeology has found evidence that confirms the presence of small villages in the region of the Palatine Hill during the period in which the mythical foundation is set. Remains of circular huts, utensils, and defensive ditches suggest that different Latin tribes began to gather there, creating a population center in a strategic location close to the Tiber River and protected by hills. Although it is impossible to prove the episode of the she-wolf or the rivalry between the brothers, these findings demonstrate that, in the middle of the 8th century before Christ, that area was beginning to turn into a center of urban life. The figure of Romulus and Remus, therefore, is more than a fable. It represents the union of rival clans and the consolidation of a collective identity. Over the centuries, Rome made this story a symbol of its ability to overcome internal conflicts and rise stronger, transforming its violent beginnings into a founding narrative meant to justify its authority and its future expansion. Rome emerged in a part of the Italian peninsula where nature seemed to have been shaped to favor the birth of a power. The location of the city, in the center of the peninsula and close to the Tiber River, became one of its greatest assets. Around the river valley rise 7 hills: Aventine, Palatine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Caelian, which gave Rome a natural defensive position, forming a kind of green and elevated wall that was difficult to attack. This geography allowed the first Latin villages, made up of small huts of clay and wood, to spread across the hilltops and later gradually unite into a larger community. The Tiber River, which crosses the region, provided drinking water, fertile land for agriculture, and a means of internal transport in addition to a natural harbour at Tiber Island. At the same time, the city was not located on the coast, which protected it from maritime attacks, but it remained close enough to the Tyrrhenian Sea to maintain easy access to trade. This balance between defensive isolation and strategic openness to commerce was decisive in allowing Rome to grow stronger as the centuries passed. The Seven Hills also contributed to shaping the Roman mentality. In ancient times, living on high ground meant safety, and communities began to build fences and palisades on the hilltops. As the population grew, the valleys between these hills were gradually occupied, giving rise to the first forums and public spaces. The hills created zones of specialization. The Palatine became the central area of power, associated early on with the nobility. The Aventine was linked to the plebeians. The Capitoline became the religious and military symbol of the city, housing temples and later the citadel. This spatial structure influenced not only the defense and urban growth, but also Roman politics and society. Furthermore, the city was located in a region of fertile volcanic soil, ideal for crops and near deposits of minerals and clay, essential for tools and construction. Rome's geographical position made it a bridge between the north and the south of the peninsula, between the inland and the sea, between Italic cultures and foreign peoples. Over time, this transformed it into an inevitable center of exchange. Peoples who passed through Latium to trade or wage war had to approach the city, and in this way Rome absorbed new ideas, technologies, weapons, religious rituals, and customs. At the same time, geography shaped the way Romans viewed the world. Aware that they lived in a privileged location, they learned from an early age to look outward, to think about expansion, and to understand that their city could become the heart of an empire. The layout of the Seven Hills not only gave Rome physical security, but also provided the framework for a collective identity focused on growth and resilience, elements that would be reflected throughout its history. After the unification of the villages around the Palatine Hill and the formation of the first urban nucleus, Rome entered a phase ruled by kings, a period known as the Roman monarchy, which, according to tradition, lasted from 753 before Christ to 509 before Christ. During this time, the city underwent profound political, religious, and social transformations that prepared it for the republican system that would follow. Among these kings, the last and most influential were of Etruscan origin, a people from the north of the Italian peninsula whose influence became decisive for the organization of Rome. The Etruscans possessed a high level of urban development, expertise in engineering, and a sophisticated religious sense which brought advancements that Rome alone had not yet developed. Upon taking power in the city, the Etruscan kings introduced public works and institutions that forever shaped Roman identity. The monarchy was characterized by centralized power. The king or rex accumulated religious, military, and political functions. He presided over ceremonies, led the troops, and administered justice, but he was assisted by a council of elders, the Senate, which, although only advisory during this period, already exerted influence over decisions. Popular assemblies also existed, though their role was limited. Among the greatest contributions of this era were the public works. Under the Etruscan kings, the first defensive walls were built, stone temples were erected, and the drainage system known as the Cloaca Maxima was developed, allowing marshes in the valley between the hills to be dried and creating the space for the Roman Forum. This central area became the political and economic heart of the city, where markets, ceremonies, and trials were held. The monarchy also consolidated religious practices that would endure for centuries, such as divination, the use of sacred symbols, and the role of priests. With Etruscan influence, Rome ceased to be a cluster of rudimentary villages and became an organized and prosperous city with intense commercial activity and constant contact with other regions of the Mediterranean. However, this influence also generated internal tensions. The presence of foreigners, combined with the increasing power of the king, sparked among the Romans a desire for autonomy. The most symbolic episode of this discontent occurred during the reign of Tarquinius, known as the Proud, the last king of Rome. His tyrannical rule and abuses, especially the incident involving the violation of the young Lucretia by his son, provoked a revolt among the nobility and the expulsion of the monarchy. Thus, in 509 before Christ, Rome began a new chapter in its history. The Republic, marked by a more collegiate system and the relentless pursuit of preventing the return of absolute power. Even so, the centuries of monarchy left an indelible mark on Roman culture, shaping its urban planning, religion, and early laws. The end of the monarchy in Rome is one of the most decisive moments in its entire history, and represents the transition from a city governed by a single man to a system in which power would be divided and supervised. The central episode of this transformation involves the figure of Lucius Tarquinius, known as Tarquinius the Proud, the last king of Rome. Belonging to a powerful Etruscan lineage, Tarquinius ascended to the throne after the death of Servius Tullius in violent and questionable circumstances, consolidating his power through fear and military alliances. His reign was marked by authoritarianism, distrust of the Senate, and an attempt to weaken the influence of patrician families, which increased internal tensions. Despite continuing to promote grandiose works in the city, such as the construction of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, Tarquinius ruled while ignoring the old traditions of consulting the Senate and the assemblies. This behavior undermined the legitimacy of the monarchy and left the Roman nobility restless, preparing the ground for a radical shift in power. The trigger for the revolt that overthrew the monarchy was not a battle or an economic crisis, but a personal and deeply humiliating event that aroused a collective feeling of indignation. According to tradition, during a military siege of the city of Ardea, the sons of noble families argued over who had the most virtuous wife. Upon returning unexpectedly to Rome, one of the young men found his wife Lucretia spinning wool at night, dedicated and honorable, while the other women were indulging in festivities. This discovery increased her reputation, but also awakened the envy and obsession of Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son. Days later, he returned alone to Lucretia's house, assaulted her, and then threatened to kill her if she denounced the crime. Even under threat, Lucretia told her father and her husband what had happened, asking them to seek vengeance, and then, overcome with shame, took her own life in front of them. This tragic act became a symbol of wounded honor and an absolute rejection of the tyranny of the Tarquins. Lucretia's act was the spark that set Rome ablaze. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, along with her father and other nobles, they swore to expel the royal family and abolish the figure of the king forever. In a decisive uprising, the Tarquins were deposed, their properties confiscated, and their alliances destroyed. Tarquinius the Proud tried to regain power several times through external alliances and military campaigns, but all of them failed. Thus, in 509 before Christ, Rome freed itself from the monarchy and created a new system of government, the Republic. This new model was born with the aim of preventing the excessive accumulation of power, establishing annual offices, such as that of consul, and strengthening the authority of the Senate. The fall of Tarquinius not only closed a chapter, but it also established a principle that would be engraved in the Roman mentality: the total rejection of tyranny. This foundational moment would be remembered for centuries as the first victory of the Roman people against the abuse of power. With the expulsion of Tarquinius the Proud in 509 before Christ, Rome began one of the most remarkable political transformations of antiquity, the creation of the Republic. The new system was neither perfect nor stable at its birth, but it was a deliberate attempt to prevent any single man from once again concentrating absolute power. To replace the king, annual and collegial offices were created, with two principal magistrates called consuls, who shared executive and military functions. These consuls were chosen by the assembly of citizens and held office for only 1 year, with no possibility of immediate re-election, which limited their influence. In extreme situations, such as an invasion, a dictator could be appointed, but his power was temporary and strictly supervised. Thus, power ceased to be hereditary and became elective and rotating, a model that reduced the risks of abuse and reinforced the role of collective authority. At the heart of this new regime was the Senate, which, although already existing during the monarchy, gained much greater prominence during the Republic. Composed of the most influential patrician families, the Senate became the political soul of Rome, responsible for advising magistrates, approving laws, and overseeing financial and diplomatic matters. This institution, with its lifelong membership, provided stability within a government that was constantly renewing itself. Another essential element was the popular assemblies, such as the centuriate assemblies and tribal assemblies, which allowed citizens to participate in the election of magistrates and vote on laws. However, this system was not egalitarian. At first, only patricians, descendants of the founding families, had real access to the most important decisions, while the plebeians, who made up the majority of the population, remained marginalized. This inequality soon became a source of social and political tension. Beyond political reorganization, the creation of the first republican institutions also brought about a new relationship between Romans and the law. From this moment on, power began to be understood as something that should serve the city rather than the personal interests of a ruler. Values that would be exalted as Roman virtues were born: discipline, duty, collegiality, and accountability. Magistrates did not govern alone. Every important decision required the backing of other bodies, which made Rome more resistant to sudden changes and coups. This initial structure was refined over the following centuries, incorporating mechanisms to give voice to the plebeians, expanding rights, and creating positions such as the tribune of the plebs. But the foundation of the Republic was established at this moment: a balance between different forces, constant renewal of power, and the primacy of the Senate as the guide of the city's destiny. This model, born from the rejection of tyranny, would become one of Rome's greatest political legacies and would directly influence systems of government long after its fall. The birth of the Republic did not bring immediate social equality. On the contrary, as soon as the kings were expelled, the tensions between the patricians and the plebeians became more evident. The patricians were the descendants of Rome's founding families, holding land, wealth, and a monopoly over political offices. The plebeians, who made up the majority of the population, were peasants, artisans, small merchants, and soldiers, responsible for sustaining the city with their labor, but without any real participation in government. This division led to a prolonged conflict called the Conflict of the Orders, which lasted for centuries and was one of the great forces shaping Roman society. Starting around 500 before Christ, the struggle of the plebeians began to take shape through protests, strikes, and even mass withdrawals from the city, such as the famous secession of the plebs to the Sacred Mount. The demands of the plebeians revolved around two main points: protection against abuses and access to magistracies. Without written laws, political and judicial decisions were made based on customs interpreted by the patricians, which allowed manipulation and injustices. For the plebeians, it was essential that the rules be clear and public. This pressure led, around 450 before Christ, to the creation of the Laws of the 12 Tables, the first written legal code of Rome. Engraved on bronze tablets and displayed in the Roman Forum, these laws addressed issues of property, contracts, family, and punishments, ensuring that everyone knew their rights and duties. Although they still favored the wealthy, they represented a historic milestone, as they created a legal standard that limited the arbitrariness of magistrates and, for the first time, established the formal equality of all citizens before the law. Over time, the plebeians achieved more victories. The office of tribune of the plebs was created, with the power to veto Senate decisions and protect the interests of the people. Other laws opened the way for plebeians to marry patricians, occupy magistracies, and even reach the consulship, the highest office of the Republic. These changes, however, were the result of ongoing struggles, and each plebeian victory was achieved with resistance and delay. This long process transformed Rome into a society where social differences did not disappear, but where institutions created mechanisms to mediate conflicts. This unique political dynamic strengthened the Republic because, while it kept the elite in power, it also created ways to gradually include other groups. Thus, the tension between patricians and plebeians, far from weakening Rome, ultimately made it more flexible and adaptable, a trait that would be fundamental in its rise as a Mediterranean power. As Rome consolidated its republican institutions and expanded over the territory of Latium, It became clear that the city's power depended not only on laws or political organization, but above all, on its military capacity. It was during this early period, between the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, that the Roman army began to transform itself into a disciplined and innovative machine, whose foundation would be the legion. Unlike the old Greek lines based on the phalanx, a rigid formation of hoplites that relied on the cohesion of the block, the Romans gradually perfected a more flexible structure, adapted to the irregular terrain of the peninsula and to the need for mobility. In the beginning, all property-owning citizens were summoned to serve in the army, bringing their own equipment and weapons, organized according to the social class determined by the census. This direct link between citizenship and military service created a society in which war was part of political life, and the duty to defend Rome stood above any personal interest. Discipline became a central value in this new model. The Roman soldier was trained not only to fight, but to endure the fatigue of long marches, to build fortified camps every day, to keep weapons in perfect condition, and to obey superior commands without hesitation. This requirement created a collective spirit of order and obedience that would become one of the hallmarks of the Roman mentality. Each legion was divided into smaller units that could move independently during combat, allowing for more sophisticated strategies. This structure, still rudimentary in its early stages, would evolve over time to become one of the most efficient military organizations of the ancient world. Soldiers were often called upon to build roads, bridges, and fortifications, which expanded the city's infrastructure and strengthened control over conquered regions. With the emergence of the legions, Rome began to project its power beyond its borders. Initially, they were used to subdue neighboring peoples such as the Etruscans, the Sabines, and the Volsci. However, the efficiency and discipline of this system soon gave Rome a strategic advantage over adversaries who still depended on improvised armies and fragile alliances. More than just an instrument of war, the legion became a symbol of citizenship and Roman identity. Those who served in the legion were not only defending their territory, but actively participating in the construction of Rome's greatness. This close relationship between military organization and the political and economic growth of the city would be one of the pillars supporting Rome's expansion for centuries, transforming war into a structuring element of the Republic and later of the empire itself. During the first centuries of the Republic, between 509 before Christ and the beginning of the 4th century before Christ, Rome experienced a period in which, while expanding territorially, it also faced a succession of internal tensions that would shape its political and social structure forever. The conflicts between patricians and plebeians continued to boil, and even after the enactment of the laws of the 12 Tables and the creation of the office of tribune of the plebs, the plebeians increasingly demanded a larger role in the city's decisions. These disputes often led to political paralysis and even episodes of secession, when the plebeians abandoned Rome and threatened not to fight in its wars unless their demands were met. This situation placed constant pressure on the Senate, the most powerful institution of the Republic, which had to balance the interests of the elite with the needs of the majority of the population to prevent the city from being weakened by internal divisions. The response to these challenges was the gradual strengthening of republican institutions, especially the Senate itself. Instead of concentrating power in individual leaders, Rome increasingly relied on collegial bodies, and the Senate assumed the role of a stable decision-making center. This council, initially composed of 300 members chosen from the patrician families, came to be consulted on all important matters, from foreign policy to the use of public resources and the administration of newly conquered provinces. Internal disputes ended up encouraging the creation of new laws and additional offices that little by little gave the plebeians more voice, but without removing the supremacy of the Senate. This capacity for negotiation and adaptation gave Rome a political system more sophisticated than that of the other cities of the peninsula, making it resistant to crises. At the same time, these internal tensions had an important side effect. They forced the city to maintain a strong and disciplined army to protect its interests. The need for territorial expansion to satisfy both patricians and plebeians led Rome to seek new lands, new wealth, and new opportunities for power. Each victorious war strengthened the Senate even further, as it assumed the task of managing the conquests and turned these new territories into a source of resources for the city. Thus, the Roman Republic created a system in which internal struggles and external ambition functioned as complementary engines. Political crises encouraged the reform of institutions, while military victories provided the fuel necessary for the system to keep functioning. By the end of this turbulent period, Rome had not only survived its own conflicts, but had emerged stronger, with a consolidated Senate and an increasingly clear vision that its city was not destined to be just a regional power, but the ruler of the Italian peninsula and in the future of the Mediterranean. With the foundations of the Republic firmly established and the Roman army increasingly disciplined, the city of Rome began a long campaign to consolidate its control over the entire Italian peninsula. Between the 5th and 3rd centuries before Christ, Rome engaged in a series of wars against the peoples who shared the peninsula, first securing its local supremacy and then eliminating powerful rivals who could threaten its expansion. These wars were not just isolated battles, but a continuous process of absorption and integration in which Roman military strength combined with pragmatic diplomacy and an impressive ability to learn from its enemies. The result was that by the end of this period, Rome had become the undisputed power of the peninsula, creating a model of domination that it would later apply on a much larger scale. The first major challenge came from the Etruscans. Heirs of a refined and urban culture, the Etruscans had fortified cities to the north of Latium, and for a long time were both allies and rivals of Rome. After the fall of the Etruscan monarchy, Rome entered a phase of conflict against these cities, defeating them one by one until, around the beginning of the 4th century before Christ, their influence in the region began to diminish drastically. This victory was not only military. Rome adopted and incorporated many elements of Etruscan culture, such as engineering techniques, religious symbols, and forms of political organization, integrating the defeated peoples instead of completely destroying them. Next, Rome had to face other nearby peoples, such as the Sabines, located in the mountainous regions to the northeast. These peoples had a strong warrior tradition and often carried out raids against Roman territories, but after years of fighting they were defeated and gradually assimilated, with many of their members going on to serve in the Roman army and participate in the city's life. The greatest challenge, however, came from the Samnites, a fierce Italic people who inhabited the mountainous region of the central southern peninsula. The Samnite Wars, which took place in 3 phases between the 4th century and the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, were some of the hardest and bloodiest conflicts in Roman Republican history. The Samnites excelled in combat on difficult terrain and frequently ambushed Roman troops, inflicting humiliating defeats such as the disaster of the Caudine Forks, when an entire Roman army was forced to surrender and pass under the yoke of their enemies. However, the Romans learned from each setback, reorganizing their legions and improving their strategies. In the end, Rome emerged victorious and annexed Samnite territories, creating a network of roads and colonies that consolidated its presence. These victories paved the way for the complete domination of the peninsula, as the other peoples realized that resisting meant facing an adversary who never surrendered and always came back stronger. By the end of these campaigns, Rome had transformed from a city-state into a territorial power, but the most remarkable aspect was how it treated the defeated peoples. Instead of destroying them, it offered treaties of alliance, partial citizenship, and the possibility of participation in the army. This method created a federation of allied cities under the leadership of Rome, guaranteeing almost inexhaustible human and military resources. Thus, the domination of Italy was not only a military triumph but also a brilliant political construction based on the gradual integration of conquered peoples, a model that would prove decisive in the much larger wars to come. As Rome advanced militarily to consolidate its power over the Italian peninsula, it encountered in the south a scenario completely different from the one it had faced against the Etruscans and the Samnites. This region, later known as Magna Graecia, was a group of colonies founded centuries earlier by Greeks who had crossed the Ionian Sea. Cities such as Tarentum, Sybaris, Croton, Cumae, and Locri were prosperous centers that brought to the peninsula a level of cultural, artistic, and economic development of great sophistication. These Greek settlements were far more urbanized and organized, with busy ports and solidly built walls, and they maintained a cultural tradition rooted in Greek philosophy, science, and religion. When Rome came into contact with this world, it not only encountered a powerful military adversary, but also a source of intellectual influence that would profoundly shape its identity. Direct contact with the Greeks occurred through both war and coexistence. On the military front, Rome was forced to face well-trained and well-equipped armies, such as that of King Pyrrhus of Epirus, who, responding to Tarentum's call for help, crossed the sea with his soldiers and war elephants at the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ. Pyrrhus's campaign was marked by Rome's difficulty in countering Hellenistic tactics and by the famous Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so costly and bloody for the Greeks that it was equivalent to a defeat. These battles became a true school for Rome, which learned new military techniques, adapted its army, and discovered how to confront adversaries from more sophisticated kingdoms. In the end, Rome emerged victorious, annexing Tarentum and bringing Magna Graecia under its control. But victory did not mean destruction. On the contrary, the Greek cities continued to exist and profoundly influenced Roman culture. On the cultural front, this influence proved even more lasting. From their coexistence with the Greeks came myths and gods that later merged with Roman deities, creating equivalents such as Zeus and Jupiter, Athena and Minerva, Aphrodite and Venus. Architectural styles, sculpture, literature, and philosophy were also absorbed areas in which Rome, until then practical and pragmatic, began to find inspiration. The Romans adopted the Greek alphabet and adapted it, gave new forms to columns and temples, and incorporated the idea that urban life should include squares, theaters, and public spaces for socializing and debate. This Hellenization of Roman culture was a slow but relentless process. Even when Rome came to dominate the Greek world militarily, cultural influence moved in the opposite direction. Rome conquered the Greeks by force, but was ultimately conquered by their culture. This fusion of Roman practicality and Greek intellectual refinement became one of the hallmarks of Roman civilization. Greek philosophy, with schools such as Stoicism and Epicureanism, found fertile ground among Roman citizens, and the pursuit of scientific knowledge, medicine and oratory transformed Rome into a cultural power as much as a military one. By assimilating and adapting Greek elements, Rome built an identity that it would later export to the entire conquered world. Thus, contact with Magna Graecia not only expanded Rome's frontiers but also shaped its soul, making it the direct heir of the classical traditions born centuries earlier in the cities of ancient Greece. At the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, Rome had already defeated the Etruscans, the Sabines, and the Samnites, consolidating its presence in the center and north of the Italian peninsula. However, one fundamental challenge remained for absolute dominance. The southern region, called Magna Graecia, filled with city-states founded centuries earlier by Greek settlers. Among these cities, Tarentum was the most powerful and influential, and it became the main obstacle to Roman expansion. Relations between Tarentum and Rome began to deteriorate when Roman ships were spotted near its port, a clear violation of an old treaty that forbade Romans from sailing in that area. The Greek city responded with hostility, attacking the ships and killing crew members. This incident turned a diplomatic tension into open conflict. Unable to face Rome alone, Tarentum called for help from Pyrrhus, king of Epirus in Greece, an ambitious ruler, a distant relative of Alexander the Great, who saw in Italy an opportunity to create an empire in the west. Pyrrhus answered the call, crossing the sea with about 25,000 soldiers reinforced by 20 war elephants, animals unknown to the Romans that would become a shocking factor on the battlefield. In 280 before Christ, the Battle of Heraclea was fought, where Greek military experience based on the phalanx, combined with the impressive strength of the elephants, defeated the Roman legions. However, this victory was costly. Pyrrhus lost thousands of soldiers and realized that Rome, unlike other adversaries, would not surrender after a defeat. The following year, in 279 before Christ, he faced the Romans again at the Battle of Asculum. Once again he won, but again at the cost of heavy losses. It was in this context that the famous expression Pyrrhic victory arose, a triumph so costly that it equals a defeat. Despite these initial successes, Pyrrhus began to understand that each victory left him weaker, while Rome continued to recruit new soldiers and reorganize its forces. After these campaigns, Pyrrhus, without sufficient resources to continue the war, decided to withdraw from Italy and return to Greece. Tarentum, weakened and without the support of the king of Epirus, was forced to surrender in 272 before Christ. The departure of Pyrrhus marked a turning point. Rome had faced one of the greatest generals of its time, and even while suffering tactical defeats, proved its strategic resilience. This conflict taught the Romans how to deal with more advanced armies and prepared them for even greater confrontations against other Mediterranean powers. Moreover, the final victory consolidated Roman control over Magna Graecia, ending centuries of autonomy of the Greek cities in the peninsula and making Rome the absolute master of Italy. In this way, the war against Pyrrhus was not only a military confrontation, but also a school of strategic learning that gave the Romans the confidence to aim at even more powerful adversaries, such as Carthage. With the domination of the entire Italian peninsula, achieved at the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, Rome ceased to be merely a regional power and began to take part in a broader network of relations with other Mediterranean peoples. The contact with different cultures, the integration of conquered cities, and the lessons learned in previous conflicts made Rome realize that winning wars was not enough. It was necessary to ensure stable agreements that kept trade routes open, guaranteed the supply of food and resources, and established lasting alliances. It was in this context that the first international treaties of Rome began to appear, diplomatic documents that formalized rules between states and marked a new stage of political maturity for the city. One of the first examples of this diplomacy was the treaty signed with Carthage as early as the 5th century before Christ, when Rome was still just a growing power. This treaty, known as the Roman-Carthaginian Treaty, established limits for navigation and trade in the Western Mediterranean, ensuring that Rome would not interfere with Carthaginian trade routes, and in return, Carthage would respect the cities under Roman protection in the peninsula. Although Rome was still far from having the strength to compete with Carthage, this agreement demonstrated that the Romans were already thinking in terms of maritime influence and protecting their commercial interests. As the Republic grew, new treaties were signed with peoples such as the Gauls, the Macedonians, and Greek cities that became allies or subjects. At the same time, this period saw the strengthening of commerce as a vital activity for Rome. The Italian peninsula had fertile soils and an abundance of agricultural products such as wheat, olive oil, and wine, but the city needed to import metals, marble, textiles, and luxury goods that came from Greece, Asia Minor, and even Egypt. The port of Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber River, became the main gateway for these goods, and Rome's central position on the peninsula allowed roads and land routes to carry these products to all regions under its control. Maritime trade also began to intensify, and Roman ships, once restricted to the coast of Italy, began to cross the Tyrrhenian Sea more frequently. This circulation of goods brought wealth and stimulated urban growth, but it also brought Rome into conflict with other powers competing for the same seas. These first steps in diplomacy and trade expanded Rome's horizons beyond Italy and prepared the stage for one of the greatest rivalries of antiquity, the struggle with Carthage for control of the Mediterranean. The practice of signing treaties and organizing alliances, combined with military skill, made Rome a city capable of projecting power not only through the force of arms, but also through political cunning. Thus, in the period immediately following the conquest of the peninsula, Rome entered a phase of transition in which its worldview ceased to be limited to its immediate neighbors and came to encompass the sea and everything it represented: trade routes, wealth, and inevitably, new enemies. At the moment when Rome consolidated the conquest of the entire Italian peninsula, at the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, it inevitably entered into a collision course with another great power of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. Located in North Africa, in the region of present-day Tunisia, Carthage had been founded centuries earlier by Phoenician colonists and had become a wealthy and influential city thanks to maritime trade. Dominating sea routes and controlling colonies and trading posts on islands such as Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily, Carthage was, in the 3rd century before Christ, the mistress of the Western Mediterranean seas. While Rome expanded by land, Carthage had built an essentially naval empire, based on a powerful fleet and control of markets. This difference in nature, a land power versus a sea power, created a direct competition for the dominance of trade routes and strategic territories. The friction point that lit the first spark of this conflict was Sicily. The island, located between Italy and North Africa, was a place of immense economic and military importance. With fertile lands and safe harbors, it became an object of dispute between several Greek cities, Carthage and finally Rome. For centuries, Carthage had already held great influence in the western part of the island, while the Greek cities controlled the eastern part. When Rome intervened at the request of one of these cities, Messana, to help it against local and Carthaginian threats, it initiated a conflict that would forever change the balance of power in the Mediterranean. This episode marked the beginning of the First Punic War in 264 before Christ and demonstrated that Rome was ready to fight outside the peninsula even without naval experience. The Punic Wars, so called because the Romans referred to the Carthaginians as Punici or Punic, were a direct result of Rome's expansion and the inevitable clash between two models of power. On one side, Carthage possessed a long maritime tradition, a mercenary army and a fleet considered the strongest in the Mediterranean. On the other side, Rome relied on trained and disciplined legions, an almost inexhaustible reserve of citizen soldiers, and an enormous capacity for adaptation. When Rome decided to enter Sicily, it knew it was challenging an enemy more experienced at sea, but it also knew that it possessed something Carthage did not: the resilience of a people who never accepted defeat. This conflict, which began as a dispute over an island, would eventually become a struggle for supremacy in the Mediterranean world. The context that led to the Punic Wars was not only territorial, but also economic. The expansion of Roman trade increased contact with markets that until then had been dominated by Carthage, which inevitably created friction. In addition, the very Roman mentality, forged by centuries of wars on the peninsula, saw in this confrontation a natural test of its strength. If they wanted to be more than a local power, they needed to defeat the greatest maritime power of their time. Thus, when the first legions set foot in Sicily, they were not only defending an allied city, they were taking the first step toward transforming Rome into an empire that would no longer know boundaries only on land, but also at sea. The First Punic War, fought between 264 and 241 before Christ, was the first major confrontation between Rome and Carthage and marked the definitive entry of the Romans into the military arena beyond the Italian peninsula. This conflict took place primarily on the island of Sicily, a strategic territory not only because of its fertility, but also because of its position between Italy and North Africa. The war began when the city of Messana asked Rome for help against the threat posed by Carthaginian forces in Syracuse. Accepting this alliance meant challenging the richest naval power in the Western Mediterranean, but the Romans, confident in their discipline and ambition, accepted the challenge. What began as a local dispute quickly turned into a large-scale conflict that dragged on for over 20 years and forced Rome to create something it had never had before: a war fleet. At the beginning of the war, Rome had no experience at sea. Its strength lay in its legions, trained for combat on land. Carthage, on the other hand, had centuries of maritime tradition, fast ships, and skilled sailors. To overcome this disadvantage, Rome resorted to its greatest virtue, the ability to learn and adapt quickly. After capturing a stranded Carthaginian ship, the Romans studied its structure and began building a fleet based on the same model. Within a few years, they managed to deploy dozens of warships, adding a crucial innovation: the so-called corvus, a type of mobile boarding bridge with hooks that during naval battles was thrown onto enemy ships, allowing Roman soldiers to board and transform a naval battle into a land fight. This simple yet brilliant invention nullified much of the Carthaginian advantage and showed how Rome could use its military discipline to win even in unfamiliar environments. The naval battles of this war were long and costly. In the beginning, Rome suffered heavy defeats, with storms destroying entire fleets, but it persisted. Over time, it achieved important victories, such as at Mylae and at Cape Ecnomus, where its strategy based on the corvus proved decisive. At the same time, the legions fought in Sicily, capturing fortresses and progressively expelling the Carthaginian forces. The conflict stretched on for 2 decades, exhausting the resources of both sides. Finally, in 241 before Christ, the Roman naval victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands forced Carthage to sue for peace. By the treaty that ended the war, Rome gained control of Sicily, its first province outside the peninsula, and Carthage had to pay a heavy indemnity in silver. More than a territorial victory, this conflict transformed Rome into a maritime power. The city that once had no fleet now dominated the surrounding seas, and the experience it had gained would prove decisive in future wars. The First Punic War marked a turning point. Rome discovered that its strength lay not only in its legions, but also in its determination never to accept defeat. It learned to fight at sea, built a fleet from scratch, faced storms, defeats, and hardships, but never gave up. At the end of this period, the balance of power in the Mediterranean began to tip toward Rome, and Carthage, though still powerful, saw its naval supremacy shaken. The next chapter of this rivalry would be even more dramatic, involving one of the greatest military geniuses in history, Hannibal. If the First Punic War transformed Rome into a maritime power, the Second Punic War, fought between 218 and 201 before Christ, was the conflict that brought the city to the brink of destruction and revealed the almost inhuman tenacity of its citizens. At the center of this confrontation stands one of the most legendary figures in military history, Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who, driven by a desire for revenge and the ambition to restore his city's power, carried out one of the most audacious and impressive campaigns ever seen. The origin of the conflict goes back to the tensions that remained after Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War. Carthage lost Sicily and was forced to pay a heavy indemnity to Rome, which made it necessary to seek new areas of influence, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, where the Barca family built a military and economic empire based on silver mines and local alliances. It was in this setting that the young Hannibal, son of Hamilcar Barca, took command of the Carthaginian forces in Hispania. From childhood, he had been raised to hate Rome, swearing, according to tradition before his father, never to be a friend of the Romans. In 219 before Christ, Hannibal attacked the city of Saguntum, an ally of Rome, triggering the war. Instead of confronting the Romans by sea, where he knew Rome had learned to fight, Hannibal chose to surprise them. He would cross the Iberian Peninsula, traverse the Pyrenees and the Alps, and enter the Italian peninsula from the north, a feat that seemed impossible. Gathering around 50,000 soldiers, 9,000 horsemen, and almost 40 war elephants, he began an epic march that would be forever remembered in history. The crossing of the Alps was an unparalleled feat of endurance and strategy. For weeks, the Carthaginian armies faced intense cold, snowstorms, food shortages, and constant attacks from hostile tribes. Narrow mountain paths, cliffs, and avalanches decimated much of the army. Many elephants died during the journey, but the mere fact of bringing these animals to the other side of the mountains was a demonstration of courage that even the Romans admired. When Hannibal finally descended through the valleys of northern Italy at the end of 218 before Christ, he had already lost a significant portion of his army, but he still brought with him a force capable of challenging Rome on its own soil, something no enemy had ever accomplished until then. The following years witnessed some of the greatest military victories of antiquity. Hannibal defeated the Romans in several battles, including the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and above all Cannae, in 216 before Christ, where his tactical genius annihilated a much larger Roman army. The double envelopment maneuver applied in this battle is studied to this day as a supreme example of military strategy. For over a decade, Hannibal remained in the Italian peninsula, devastating the Roman countryside and threatening the city, but never managing to capture Rome itself. His campaign exposed the weaknesses of the Republic, but also revealed its strength. Even in the face of devastating defeats, the Romans refused to negotiate peace and continued to recruit new armies, demonstrating an extraordinary capacity for resilience. This determination would later lead to the reversal that put General Publius Cornelius Scipio on the path to confronting Hannibal in African territory, culminating in the decisive Battle of Zama. After more than 15 years of war and Hannibal's devastating campaign in the Italian peninsula, Rome found in one of its young generals the ability to turn the tide. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, emerged as the commander who would lead Rome to its final victory in the Second Punic War. While Hannibal remained in Roman territory, trying to break the Republic's morale, Scipio devised a bold strategy. Instead of continuing to confront Hannibal on Italian soil, He would take the war directly to Africa, forcing Carthage to defend itself and compelling Hannibal to abandon his campaign. To execute this plan, Scipio first secured Roman supremacy in the Iberian Peninsula by driving out the Carthaginians and conquering their rich territories. With this step accomplished, in 204 before Christ, he crossed the sea and landed in North Africa, gaining the support of local tribes hostile to Carthage, such as the Numidians. Carthage, threatened in its own territory, had no choice but to summon Hannibal back. The Carthaginian general returned to his city after years of campaigning in Italy, fully aware that he was about to face an adversary unlike any he had encountered before. In 202 before Christ, the forces of Rome and Carthage met at Zama, a plain about 160 kilometers from Carthage. The Carthaginian army still included war elephants and experienced veterans, but the Romans, now trained to handle this threat, had developed specific tactics to neutralize these animals. Scipio organized his legions into open columns, creating corridors through which the elephants could be diverted while being targeted with javelins and spears. This maneuver drastically reduced the impact of the initial Carthaginian charge. The battle then turned into direct infantry combat. Scipio used the discipline of the legions to advance in coordinated blocks, while the Numidian cavalry, allied with Rome, circled around the battlefield and attacked the Carthaginian lines from the rear. This movement proved decisive. Hannibal's army, encircled and attacked from all sides, eventually collapsed. The defeat was absolute and definitively ended the Second Punic War. By the treaty that followed, Carthage was forced to surrender its fleet, pay a colossal indemnity, and abandon any military ambitions outside the African territory. Rome, in turn, consolidated its position as the main power of the Western Mediterranean. The victory at Zama was not just a military conquest, but a symbolic moment in Rome's history. Hannibal, who had been considered invincible for years, was finally defeated, and Rome demonstrated to the world its resilience and its ability to adapt. Scipio Africanus entered history as one of the greatest generals of antiquity, and his victory marked the beginning of a period in which Rome would transform from a regional power into an expanding empire. With the Carthaginian threat neutralized, Rome turned its eyes to new campaigns of conquest, now certain that no force could stop it as long as it maintained its discipline and determination. After Hannibal's definitive defeat at Zama in the year 202 before Christ, Carthage was forced to accept a humiliating peace and to live under the constant surveillance of Rome. For about 50 years, the African city, once mistress of the Western Mediterranean, remained weakened and forbidden to declare war without Roman authorization. However, even limited, Carthage managed to recover economically thanks to the fertility of its lands and the skill of its merchants. This economic rebirth aroused the concern and envy of many Roman senators, especially figures like Cato the Elder, who ended all his speeches in the Senate with the famous phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed." Rome's hostility grew as it saw its former rival prosper again, and any sign of resistance was used as justification for a new confrontation. The spark came when Carthage, pressured by attacks from the neighboring kingdom of Numidia and prevented by Rome from fully defending itself, decided in a desperate act to take up arms to protect its borders without waiting for Roman authorization. This gesture was interpreted as a direct violation of the treaty imposed after the Second Punic War and offered Rome the pretext that some had long desired to eliminate its old adversary once and for all. In 149 before Christ, the Third Punic War began, and Rome sent an army to lay siege to the city of Carthage. Unlike the previous wars, this would not be a prolonged campaign across multiple territories, but a direct siege, whose objective was not only to defeat, but to annihilate the rival city. The siege of Carthage lasted 3 years and was one of the most brutal of antiquity. Despite being weakened and poorly equipped, the Carthaginian population showed desperate courage, fortifying walls, manufacturing improvised weapons, and resisting fiercely against the Roman attempts to invade. The city suffered from hunger, disease, and continuous bombardment. In 146 before Christ, the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, finally managed to break through the Carthaginian defenses. What followed was a fight street by street, house by house, until the entire city was taken. The massacre was terrible. Thousands of inhabitants were killed, Many others sold into slavery, and the buildings were systematically destroyed. To mark the symbolic end of the rivalry, the Romans razed Carthage and, according to tradition, scattered salt on the ground so that nothing would grow there again. With the destruction of Carthage, Rome forever eliminated the Punic threat and came to dominate without rivals the entire western Mediterranean. The victory in the Third Punic War transformed the region of North Africa into a new Roman province, opening the way for future campaigns of expansion. More than a military triumph, this war consolidated a mentality in Rome that no enemy, no matter how powerful, could stand against the strength and persistence of the Roman people. From that moment on, the Mediterranean would begin to be called Mare Nostrum, RC, because in fact its entire expanse was under the direct or indirect influence of the Roman Republic. With Carthage finally destroyed in 146 before Christ, Rome consolidated itself as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. At the same time, however, its interests and ambitions turned toward the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Hellenistic world, formed after the death of Alexander the Great, remained divided into wealthy and culturally advanced kingdoms. Greece, the cradle of philosophers, artists, and strategists, was fragmented and weakened by internal conflicts and disputes between cities and leagues, making it an inevitable target for the Roman Republic. The first direct contact of Rome with the Greeks as military adversaries occurred around the beginning of the 2nd century before Christ, when Greek cities sought Roman protection against the threat of Macedonia and other Hellenistic kingdoms. Initially, Rome presented itself as an ally, but over time this protective relationship turned into domination. The military campaigns against Macedonia were decisive for this expansion. The First Macedonian War, fought during the Second Punic War, was only the beginning of a series of conflicts. Later, the battles of Cynocephalae in 197 before Christ and Pydna in 168 before Christ definitively ended the autonomy of the Macedonian kingdom, turning it into a Roman province. With the fall of Macedonia, Rome turned its attention to the Greek city-states, which from then on lived under the constant influence of the Republic. In 146 before Christ, the same year that Carthage was destroyed, the city of Corinth was sacked as an exemplary punishment for resisting Roman authority. This act symbolized the end of Greek political freedom and the consolidation of Rome as the undisputed mistress of the Eastern Mediterranean as well. However, the conquest of Greece did not mean cultural destruction. On the contrary, Rome began to absorb Greek values, art, and knowledge with intensity. The Romans, until then known for their practicality and militaristic character, were profoundly transformed by contact with Hellenistic sophistication. Greek literature, philosophy, and science were brought to Rome, and many young aristocrats began studying with Greek masters to learn rhetoric, logic, and the arts. Greek architects and sculptors began to work on Roman constructions, introducing columns, statues, and temples in classical styles. Greek gods and myths were integrated into Roman religion, and terms such as theater, democracy, and philosophy became part of the Republic's cultural vocabulary. This process became known as the Hellenization of Rome. This movement of cultural appropriation and fusion had profound effects. Rome conquered Greece militarily, but was culturally conquered by it. While Roman legions physically dominated the territory, Greek culture dominated Roman thought. Hellenistic influence shaped how Rome would build its cities, organize its libraries, educate its elite, and even think about political and philosophical issues. Greece became an idealized model for intellectual life, and the Romans, without losing their practical identity, incorporated Greek refinement to create a unique civilization. Thus, Rome's victory over Greece was not just a military achievement. It marked the beginning of a new stage in which the Republic ceased to be merely a warrior power and began to become a legitimate and transformative heir to classical culture. After securing its supremacy in the Western Mediterranean, with the destruction of Carthage and the conquest of Greece in the east, Rome turned to a territory that, although already the stage of important campaigns during the wars against Carthage, still represented an immense challenge: the Iberian Peninsula, which the Romans called Hispania. This vast land, rich in precious metals such as gold and silver, was inhabited by various tribal peoples, resistant, accustomed to rugged terrain, and with little political centralization. The Roman occupation of Hispania began as early as the Second Punic War, when Publius Cornelius Scipio expelled the Carthaginian forces and took control of the region, but consolidating that conquest proved to be a slow and brutal process, marked by centuries of resistance. The wars in Hispania were particularly difficult for the Romans because the local peoples, such as the Lusitanians and Celtiberians, knew the terrain deeply and frequently used guerrilla tactics. Among these peoples, one of the most emblematic episodes was the resistance of the city of Numantia, located in the region of the present-day province of Soria. Numantia became a symbol of indigenous opposition to Roman occupation. Between 153 and 133 before Christ, the Celtiberians of that city faced successive Roman campaigns, defeating better-equipped armies thanks to ambushes and the advantage of the mountainous terrain. For almost 20 years, Rome tried to subdue Numantia without success, suffering humiliations and severe attrition. The final siege took place in 134 before Christ, led by the same general who destroyed Carthage, Scipio Aemilianus. Learning from past mistakes, he did not attack directly but surrounded the city and built an impenetrable blockade, cutting off supplies completely. For months, the inhabitants of Numantia resisted in extreme conditions until hunger and disease became unbearable. Realizing that defeat was inevitable and that they would be reduced to slavery, the Numantians made a desperate choice. They set fire to their own city and preferred death to submission. When the Romans finally entered Numantia, they found only smoldering ruins and corpses. This tragedy left a deep mark, turning Numantia into an eternal symbol of resistance and freedom against foreign domination. The destruction of Numantia consolidated Roman dominance in the region, but the total conquest of Hispania would still take decades of additional fighting. These conflicts showed that Rome, although powerful, was not invincible, and that conquering peoples accustomed to resistance required more than brute force. It demanded patience, planning, and the characteristic determination of the Roman mentality. At the end of this period, the Iberian Peninsula would become one of the most important provinces of the empire, providing soldiers, metals, and wealth that would be essential to Roman expansion. But the price was extremely high. A war of attrition that taught the Romans the strategic value of turning conquered enemies into integrated allies, a model that would be replicated in other territories in the centuries to come. After the brutal campaigns in Hispania, Rome turned its attention to two other fronts that would decisively shape its territorial expansion: Cisalpine Gaul, located in the north of the Italian peninsula, and the region of Macedonia in the east. These two theaters of operations, though very different from one another, required from the Roman army both the strength of the legions and the patience of prolonged campaigns, consolidating the Roman pattern of conquering, integrating, and reorganizing territories into provinces directly controlled by the Senate. In Cisalpine Gaul, the region that comprises the valley of the Po River, the Romans faced Gallic tribes that had been a nightmare since centuries earlier. At the beginning of the 4th century before Christ, the Gauls had sacked the very city of Rome, leaving behind a traumatic memory and a lasting desire for vengeance. Now, in the 2nd century before Christ, Rome was determined to eliminate this threat forever. The Gallic tribes were extremely warlike, using wild tactics and quick raids, taking advantage of open terrain and dense forests. For years, the legions were forced to fight in harsh campaigns, building fortifications and roads to maintain control over the territory. After successive victories, Rome managed to drive the Gallic tribes out of the region, incorporating Cisalpine Gaul into Roman territory and ensuring that the north of the peninsula was under complete Roman control. From that point on, the region began to be Romanized with the foundation of colonies and the construction of urban centers, paving the way for future, more ambitious campaigns beyond the Alps. While consolidating its position in northern Italy, Rome also expanded its influence in the Greek world, especially in Macedonia. Macedonia, which had been the heart of Alexander the Great's empire, after his death fragmented into Hellenistic kingdoms that rivaled each other. Rome, initially called in as an ally in internal disputes, began to intervene directly and gradually became the dominant power. Macedonian resistance ended with a series of conflicts known as the Macedonian Wars. The decisive battle occurred in 168 before Christ at Pydna, where the Roman legions defeated the traditional Macedonian phalanx. This victory demonstrated the superiority of the flexibility of Roman formations over the rigid lines of the phalanx. After the defeat, the Macedonian kingdom ceased to exist as an independent power and was transformed into a Roman province. With this, Rome consolidated its position as the arbiter of Greek affairs, assuming political and military control over almost the entire eastern Mediterranean. These simultaneous campaigns in Cisalpine Gaul and Macedonia illustrate Rome's ability to fight in different settings with strategies adapted to each enemy. In the open fields of Gaul, brute force and discipline were decisive. In the mountains and valleys of Macedonia, organized tactics and the ability to break classical formations prevailed. At the end of these wars, Rome not only eliminated historical enemies and potential rivals, but also expanded the concept of Roman domination, transforming conquered areas into territories organized and connected by roads, laws, and trade. This ability to consolidate victories turned the Republic into an empire in practice, even before it officially held that title. After the victory over Macedonia and the subjugation of Greece, Rome came into direct contact with the vast wealth and cultural sophistication of the eastern Mediterranean. In the 2nd century before Christ, the Republic was no longer just a military power of the Italian peninsula, but a hegemonic force that began to absorb a constant flow of tributes, works of art, jewels, spices, precious metals, and ideas from the conquered territories. The destruction of Hellenistic kingdoms and the transformation of these regions into Roman provinces placed under Rome's control immense treasures that had been accumulated for centuries in the eastern courts. This sudden flow of wealth caused profound changes in the economy and in the very mentality of the Roman aristocracy. The eastern cities, especially the Greek ones, were filled with statues, temples, libraries, and works that expressed a level of artistic refinement unknown to many Romans. These treasures were brought back as spoils of war to Rome, filling the mansions of victorious generals and changing the urban landscape. Palaces began to be decorated with sculptures and mosaics brought from Athens, Corinth, Rhodes, and Pergamum. Luxurious objects, fine fabrics, and perfumes began to circulate in increasing quantities. At the same time, philosophical ideas such as Stoicism and Epicureanism gained space among young patricians who, upon returning from these campaigns, brought Greek masters to teach rhetoric, philosophy, and literature. Rome began to experience a cultural transformation. The practical and austere republic began to be dazzled by the sophistication of the Eastern world. With the wealth also came deep economic changes. The gold and silver acquired were used to finance new campaigns, pay soldiers, and carry out public works. However, this sudden increase in wealth also brought inequality. Many small farmers could no longer compete with large estates, and the concentration of land in the hands of patricians increased, fueling social tensions. Moreover, with the domination of the East, Rome gained direct access to trade routes that brought products even from Asia Minor and, indirectly, from distant regions such as India. This integration turned Rome into a central hub of an increasingly interconnected world. On the other hand, the arrival of this Eastern culture provoked intense moral debates. Many conservative senators saw in these foreign influences a risk of corrupting the simplicity and traditional values of Rome, which were based on hard work, discipline, and sobriety. Others, more open-minded, believed that the absorption of these ideas and arts could strengthen Rome, making it not only a military power, but also a cultural center. This tension between the old and the new would shape the Roman spirit in the following decades and create an environment where the brilliance of the East would be incorporated and transformed without Rome completely losing its identity. The incorporation of the East not only brought material wealth, but also redefined what it meant to be Roman. With the near-total control of the Mediterranean and the arrival of wealth from the East, Rome in the 2nd century before Christ became a city of deep contrasts. On one side stood an extremely rich aristocratic elite formed by victorious generals, senators, and merchants who profited from the wars. On the other, a mass of impoverished citizens, farmers who had lost their lands and crowded into Rome in search of sustenance. Long military campaigns had taken many small landowners away from their properties. During their absence, these lands were purchased by the richest families, who formed large estates known as latifundia, cultivated using slave labor. The result was a growing social crisis, in which multitudes of free Romans found themselves without means of survival, while the city became increasingly dependent on slave labor. It was in this scenario that the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus emerged, two young tribunes of the plebs, who, between the years 133 and 121 before Christ, tried to deeply reform the agrarian and social structure of Rome. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune in 133 before Christ, proposed a law that limited the size of public lands that could be occupied by the rich and redistributed the surplus to poor citizens, with the aim of restoring small property and strengthening the class of small farmers. This proposal directly affected the privileges of the senatorial elite and therefore generated fierce opposition. Although it was approved in the popular assembly, the law made Tiberius a political target. In the same year, during a riot in the Senate, he was murdered along with many of his supporters. It was the first time in centuries that open and organized violence erupted within the city of Rome itself as a political instrument. About 10 years later, his brother Gaius Gracchus resumed the fight for reforms, but with an even broader vision. He proposed not only the redistribution of land, but also measures to reduce the price of grain, grant greater political power to the equestrians, an emerging class of merchants, and create new colonies outside Italy to resettle poor citizens. Moreover, he advocated for greater participation of Rome's Italian allies in the city's political life. These proposals deeply threatened the traditional power structure, which saw in these reforms a risk to aristocratic control. Gaius gained strong popular support, but he ultimately faced a violent reaction similar to his brothers. In 121 before Christ, a confrontation between his followers and senatorial forces ended in a massacre, and Gaius chose to take his own life rather than be captured. The death of the Gracchus brothers marked a point of no return in the history of the Republic. For the first time, internal social conflicts had led to bloodshed within the city itself, and violence came to be seen as a legitimate political tool. The causes that motivated the actions of the Gracchi, social inequality, concentration of land, corruption in the Senate, and lack of opportunities for poorer citizens, were not resolved. On the contrary, these tensions continued to grow in the following decades and paved the way for ambitious figures and powerful generals who would use this dissatisfaction to win the support of the masses and challenge the Senate, gradually weakening the republican institutions. Thus, the attempts of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus to save the Republic, paradoxically, ended up revealing the deep fractures that would later lead to its collapse. At the end of the 2nd century before Christ, Rome faced a crisis that combined internal challenges with external threats. Social inequality, worsened by the failure of the Gracchi brothers' reforms, had produced a growing mass of impoverished citizens, while dangerous enemies arose beyond the peninsula, such as the Cimbri and Teutones, Germanic peoples who crossed the Alps and began devastating Roman territories. It was in this context that a central figure emerged, Gaius Marius, a general and politician who would radically change the military structure of Rome and, in doing so, forever alter the political balance of the Republic. Marius was a man of relatively modest origins, coming from the equestrian class, and he built his reputation through his military skill. In 107 before Christ, he assumed the consulship and began deep reforms in the Roman army. Until then, military service had been restricted to landowning citizens, as each soldier was required to provide his own equipment. This requirement limited the number of men available for service and excluded much of the poorer population. Marius broke this paradigm by recruiting volunteers with no property, known as the opening of the army to the capite censi, citizens who owned nothing but their own heads. With this, he created a professional army, equipped and financed by the state, rather than relying solely on the rural aristocracy. This change not only dramatically increased the number of soldiers available, but also created a personal bond between soldiers and their generals. In addition to including the poor, Marius reorganized the structure of the legions, replacing the old manipular formations with more flexible cohorts, standardizing training, and making the forces more agile and adaptable. He also reinforced discipline and combined maneuvers, which elevated the efficiency of the legions in large-scale battles. This reorganization proved crucial in his campaigns against Jugurtha, king of Numidia, and especially against the Cimbri and Teutones. In battles such as those of Aquae Sextiae and Vercelli, Marius achieved crushing victories that saved Rome from the invasion of these Germanic peoples, consolidating his fame as one of the greatest generals in Roman history. However, these reforms brought profound political consequences. By creating a professional army supported by the state, Marius, perhaps without foreseeing it, transferred the soldiers' loyalty from the Republic to the general who recruited and paid them. From that moment on, armies began to act not only as instruments of the city of Rome, but as personal forces at the service of their commanders. This new bond paved the way for the rise of charismatic military leaders, such as Sulla, Pompey, Julius Caesar, and others, who would use these loyal legions as a tool to challenge the Senate itself. Thus, Marius's reforms, essential for the survival of Rome in a critical moment, also planted the seeds that would contribute to the fall of the Republic. With these changes, Rome came to possess an army more powerful than ever, but also more dangerous to its own institutions. Marius's success showed that the Republic now depended on strong generals to face external threats, and these same generals, strengthened, began to aspire to control internal politics, turning war into a direct path to power. With the military reforms carried out by Gaius Marius and the resulting empowerment of the generals, Rome entered the 1st century before Christ, immersed in a succession of civil wars that exposed the fragility of its republican institutions. Among the most striking figures of this period was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician aristocrat who distinguished himself as a general in the campaigns against Mithridates, king of Pontus, and who became the first man to use the Roman army to march on the city of Rome itself, impose his personal power, and inaugurate a period of political terror that would leave deep scars. The rivalry between Sulla and Gaius Marius began when the Senate entrusted Sulla with the command of the war against Mithridates in the east. Marius, already elderly but still ambitious, maneuvered politically to seize that command. In response, Sulla did something unprecedented. He gathered his legions and marched on Rome, an action until then considered unthinkable and illegal. With the streets dominated by his troops, Sulla reclaimed the command and departed for the east, where he achieved great victories. While he was away, Marius returned, allied himself with the populares, and reassumed power, persecuting Sulla's supporters. However, after Marius's death, Sulla returned victorious to Rome in 82 before Christ and began his revenge, which would be marked by blood and fear. The most infamous instrument of Sulla's rule were the so-called proscriptions. He published lists containing the names of his political enemies, declaring them outlaws. Anyone could kill them without consequence, and their properties were confiscated by the state. These lists were constantly updated and became a weapon of political terror, used both to eliminate opponents and to intimidate and enrich allies. Hundreds of senators, equestrians, and citizens were killed or stripped of their fortunes. This period inaugurated a dark phase in Roman history, when violence became an institutionalized mechanism of power. In addition to the proscriptions, Sulla carried out political reforms aimed at strengthening the Senate and weakening the plebeian assemblies and tribunes, attempting to restore a more aristocratic model of government. However, by concentrating so much power in his own hands, he undermined the credibility of the very institutions he claimed to defend. After a few years in power as dictator, Sulla shocked Rome by voluntarily resigning and retiring to private life. This act, far from restoring stability, only proved that a man with the loyalty of legions could seize power at any moment. The precedent was set. The legacy of Sulla was devastating. The Republic would never be the same. His dictatorship showed that the legions no longer belonged to the state, but to the generals, and that internal violence had become an acceptable path to power. The proscriptions sowed an atmosphere of distrust and fear, weakened the senatorial class, and prepared the ground for the great conflicts to come. Instead of saving the Republic, Sulla demonstrated that it was mortally wounded, and from this point on, Rome's history would be marked by an escalation of civil wars. In the 1st century before Christ, while Rome became wealthier and more powerful, its social structure carried tensions that periodically erupted in violence. One of these tensions was the growing dependence on slave labor. With the enormous influx of prisoners brought in by conquest, Italy was full of men and women reduced to property, used on plantations, in mines, and even as gladiators for public entertainment. The brutality of this system produced frequent revolts, but none had such an impact as the one led by Spartacus between 73 and 71 before Christ, an episode that put Roman order at risk and once again revealed how internal inequality could shake the Republic. Spartacus was a Thracian who had served as a soldier but ended up enslaved and sent to a gladiatorial school in the city of Capua. In 73 before Christ, together with about 70 companions, he organized a spectacular escape, killing the guards and fleeing with improvised weapons. At first, it seemed like an isolated uprising, but it quickly attracted thousands of other runaway slaves, rural laborers, and even impoverished free peasants who saw in this revolt a chance for freedom. The group grew impressively, transforming into an army that numbered more than 60,000 men, capable of defeating successive Roman forces sent to contain it. For 2 years, this improvised army roamed the peninsula, winning battles against Roman legions and spreading panic among landowners. Spartacus's skill as a military leader surprised Rome. He avoided direct confrontations when necessary, exploited geography to set ambushes, and managed to maintain cohesion among an extremely diverse group. His initial intention was to cross the Alps and escape from Italy, but many of his followers wished to stay and plunder, which delayed their plans and gave Rome time to organize a definitive response. This response came under the leadership of Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, who took command of the Roman forces and imposed severe discipline. Crassus used ruthless tactics, including the decimation of his own troops, killing 1 out of every 10 soldiers in units that fled in battle, to restore obedience and gradually encircled the rebels. The final confrontation took place in southern Italy in 71 before Christ. Spartacus fought bravely in the decisive battle, attempting to break through the Roman lines, but he was killed in combat. The repression that followed was brutal. About 6,000 prisoners were crucified along the Appian Way, a public display of the fate that awaited those who challenged Rome. Although the Spartacus revolt failed, it left an indelible mark on history. It revealed Rome's internal vulnerability, the strength of the desire for freedom, and the brutality of the slave system. At the same time, it reinforced the belief among Roman leaders that maintaining order depended not only on legions, but also on terror as a political tool. This rebellion showed that as the Republic expanded across the world, it was also building a minefield of social tensions that would repeatedly explode until its eventual collapse. In the 1st century before Christ, after decades of civil wars and internal uprisings, Rome began to produce military leaders who, in addition to being generals, were also ambitious politicians. Among these men, no name became more famous than that of Gaius Julius Caesar. With extraordinary charisma and impressive military talent, Caesar knew how to transform the legions into instruments of his personal rise. His most remarkable campaign, the one that changed the history of Rome, was the conquest of Gaul, a series of wars that extended from 58 to 50 before Christ and pushed Rome's frontiers to the north of Europe. When Caesar assumed command of Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul, the regions north of Italy were still constantly threatened by incursions from Gallic tribes. These tribes lived in warrior confederations and possessed an independent and proud culture. Caesar decided that, in order to consolidate his political position in Rome and secure personal glory, he needed to subjugate Gaul completely. Over 8 years of nearly uninterrupted campaigns, he confronted dozens of Gallic tribes and kingdoms. His strategies combined speed, military engineering, and an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. Caesar used the roads that his own troops built, constructed wooden bridges in record time, and erected advanced fortifications in just a few days, ensuring mobility and constant protection for the legions. Among the most notable episodes of this campaign was the crossing of the Rhine, where Caesar built a bridge in only 10 days to demonstrate to the Germanic tribes that not even the river could protect them. He also crossed the English Channel on expeditions against the Britons, marking the first Roman contact with the British Isles. But the most decisive moment came in 52 before Christ, at the Battle of Alesia. Led by Vercingetorix, the Gallic tribes finally united in a great coalition to confront Caesar. The battle became a supreme example of Roman engineering and strategy. Around the fortress of Alesia, Caesar built 2 lines of fortification, one facing inward to besiege the Gauls and another facing outward to prevent reinforcements from aiding them. Even surrounded and outnumbered, Caesar managed to win. Vercingetorix surrendered, and Gaul was incorporated as a Roman province. The conquest of Gaul had immense consequences. Rome gained fertile lands, access to resources such as wheat and metals, and an enormous influx of slaves and tribute. For Caesar, this victory brought something even more valuable: the unconditional loyalty of his legions and a prestige that rivaled any other Roman leader. This power, however, also ignited rivalry with the Senate and with Pompey, his former ally in the First Triumvirate. When returning from Gaul, Caesar was no longer just a victorious general. He was a direct threat to the very structure of the Republic. The Gallic Wars, immortalized by himself in his written commentaries, were the springboard for a new phase in Rome's history. The civil war that would make Caesar the most powerful figure of his era and forever change the destiny of the Republic. Julius Caesar's success in Gaul was not only a military achievement, but a calculated step in a much larger political game. Even before conquering the region, Caesar understood that, to reach power in Rome, it was necessary to form strategic alliances within a republic that, in practice, was already living an open struggle between the old senatorial aristocracy and the generals who commanded loyal armies. Thus, in 60 before Christ, an informal political alliance was born between three immensely powerful men: Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. This union, known as the First Triumvirate, was not an official institution of the Republic, but a secret pact to divide power among themselves and rule Rome outside of Senate control. Each of them had a specific interest in this alliance. Pompey was an acclaimed general who had defeated pirates in the Mediterranean, conquered territories in the east and returned to Rome as a hero, but faced resistance from the Senate in having his conquests recognized and his troops rewarded with land. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, wielded economic influence but sought military glory to match Pompey's prestige. Caesar, for his part, came from a more fragile position and needed political and financial support to consolidate his career and secure military command in Gaul. United, the three overcame senatorial opposition, passed laws that favored their interests, and assumed near total control of the Republic's decisions. The triumvirate, however, was doomed to collapse from the start. As Caesar conquered Gaul and his prestige grew, the balance of power became uneven. The death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife in 54 before Christ, broke the family bond that helped maintain the alliance. Shortly after, in 53 before Christ, Crassus died in the disastrous campaign against the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae, eliminating the third pillar of the pact. With only 2 men left, the rivalry between Pompey and Caesar became inevitable. The Senate, fearing Caesar's power, aligned itself with Pompey, who was appointed sole consul, an exceptional position, while ordering Caesar to give up command of his legions and return to Rome without his army. Caesar's refusal to obey the Senate culminated in the famous episode of crossing the Rubicon River in 49 before Christ. By crossing that sacred boundary with his troops, Caesar declared war on the Republic and began a civil conflict that would forever change Rome's destiny. The triumvirate, which had begun as a pact to avoid internal confrontations, ended up becoming the catalyst for the civil war that would make Caesar dictator and seal the end of the Republican balance. The alliance that had dominated Rome for a few years demonstrated in its downfall that the concentration of power in the hands of a few men with loyal armies was incompatible with the survival of the ancient Senate institutions. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 before Christ, defying the order of the Senate and the authority of Pompey, the Roman Republic plunged into one of the most dramatic and decisive civil wars in its history. The crossing of that small river in northern Italy represented far more than a mere military act. It was an open declaration that Caesar preferred to face his rivals with arms rather than relinquish the power he had gained. With the legendary phrase, "the die is cast," he launched a swift campaign against Pompey and the senators who supported him, forever altering the political balance of Rome. The civil war was marked by strategic speed. Caesar advanced with his veteran legions from Gaul, soldiers fiercely loyal to him, and seized Italy almost without resistance, as many of Pompey's allies fled to Greece. He then pursued Pompey in a series of campaigns. In 48 before Christ, at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, Caesar achieved a decisive victory. Pompey fled to Egypt hoping to find refuge, but he was assassinated by his own Egyptian advisors in an attempt to gain favor with the victor. This episode made it clear that the ancient world already recognized the inevitability of Caesar's rise. After this triumph, he became briefly involved in Egyptian affairs, supporting Cleopatra in her dispute for the throne, thereby strengthening his political alliances. With Pompey defeated, Caesar returned to Rome and began a series of deep reforms. Appointed dictator on a provisional basis, he reorganized the distribution of land, reduced debts, extended citizenship to many regions outside Italy, and reformed the Roman calendar, creating the Julian calendar, the basis of the one we use today. Moreover, he weakened the Senate, turning it into a symbolic rather than a decisive body. These measures modernized and centralized administration, but they also increased the resentment of many aristocrats who saw the concentration of power in Caesar's hands as a threat to republican liberty. In 44 before Christ, Caesar was named perpetual dictator, or dictator for life, a title that effectively marked the end of republican traditions. Caesar's accumulation of power stirred fears that he was about to declare himself king, something the Romans had despised ever since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud centuries before. This suspicion led to a conspiracy within the Senate itself. On the 15th of March in 44 before Christ, on the famous Ides of March, a group of senators, including some of his closest allies such as Brutus and Cassius, assassinated him with multiple stab wounds during a session. The conspirators' objective was to restore the Republic, but the result was exactly the opposite. Caesar's death plunged Rome into another, even bloodier civil war, from which a new, even more absolute form of power would emerge, putting a definitive end to the Republic and ushering in the imperial period. Caesar's lifetime dictatorship was a turning point in the history of Rome. His military conquests and administrative reforms consolidated a model of personal leadership that the Republic could no longer restrain. His death did not save the old order, it only hastened its destruction. From that moment on, Rome was destined to be governed not by collegiate institutions, but by a strong man who concentrated all power in his hands. The assassination of Julius Caesar, which took place on the 15th of March in 44 before Christ, during the famous Ides of March, was one of the most momentous events in the history of Rome. The scene was forever engraved in the memory of the ancient world. Caesar, surrounded by dozens of senators in Pompey's Curia, received more than 20 stab wounds, including one from Brutus, one of his closest allies. This betrayal by men he had rewarded with power and offices gave the act an even greater symbolic weight. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, believed they were saving the Republic from the absolute domination of a man who, by being appointed dictator for life, seemed to have destroyed republican traditions and threatened to crown himself king. However, the consequence of this act was the opposite of what they had intended. In the days immediately following Caesar's death, Rome plunged into political chaos. The population, which mostly admired and respected Caesar, reacted with fury upon hearing the news of the assassination. His public funeral, organized by Mark Antony, his close ally and friend, turned into a massive demonstration. Mark Antony read aloud Caesar's will, in which he left generous sums of money to Roman citizens and distributed public lands, as well as announcing the adoption of his grand-nephew, Gaius Octavius. The reading of the will inflamed the crowd, who began to see the conspirators not as saviors of liberty, but as traitors. Brutus and Cassius, realizing they lacked popular support, fled Rome, and the city came under the control of Antony and, soon after, the young Octavian. The power vacuum created by Caesar's death triggered a new and even more intense civil war. Mark Antony sought to control the political legacy of the dictator, but faced an unexpected rival in Octavian, who would later become Augustus. The Senate, trying to recover balance, initially supported the conspirators, but soon found itself entangled in the spiral of violence that engulfed the city. The assassination, which was supposed to save the Republic, definitively revealed that the traditional institutions were incapable of dealing with the ambitions of powerful generals and the political strength of the legions loyal to them. The Republic was already dead. Only the matter of who would take absolute command of the state remained. The period following Caesar's assassination would be marked by unstable alliances and bloody battles. Shortly thereafter, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus would form the second triumvirate to avenge Caesar's death and eliminate his assassins, resulting in the Battle of Philippi in 42 before Christ. where Brutus and Cassius were defeated and took their own lives to avoid capture. But this alliance too would be temporary, culminating in a new power struggle, primarily between Mark Antony and Octavian, which would turn the following years into the last great civil war of the Republic. From this turbulence, a new political system would emerge, the Roman Empire. The death of Caesar, therefore, was not the end of Rome's problems, but the final blow that destroyed the republican structure and opened the way for unified rule under a single man. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 before Christ, the Roman Republic plunged into the most chaotic phase of its existence. With the dictator's death, a power vacuum emerged that would be disputed by the two men closest to him: Mark Antony, his right-hand man and trusted general, and Gaius Octavius, his grandnephew and adopted heir, a young man of only 19 years who quickly demonstrated an extraordinary political intelligence. This rivalry, however, did not begin immediately. Faced with the need to avenge Caesar's death and crush the conspirators, Antony and Octavian decided to join forces, forming, together with Lepidus, an official alliance known as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the secret pact between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus years earlier, this new triumvirate received full legal legitimacy, with almost unlimited powers to reorganize Rome. The first objective of this pact was to eliminate Caesar's assassins. In 42 before Christ, at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia, the forces of the triumvirate defeated the armies of Brutus and Cassius, who, with no escape, chose to take their own lives. With the death of the conspirators, Rome once again fell into the hands of a few strong men. However, this union soon turned into an open conflict. Lepidus was removed from power, and the alliance was left only between Mark Antony and Octavian. While Octavian consolidated his authority on the Italian peninsula and strengthened his base of support in the Senate, Mark Antony turned to the east, where he formed a political and romantic alliance with Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. Cleopatra, who had previously borne a child by Julius Caesar, saw in Antony an opportunity to ensure the independence of her kingdom and maintain influence over Rome. The relationship between Mark Antony and Cleopatra quickly became more than political. United by the desire to challenge Octavian's power, they began to gather resources and armies in Egypt, building a position that Rome increasingly viewed as a threat. Octavian, in turn, took advantage of this situation to construct a propaganda narrative in Rome. He portrayed Antony as a traitor who had abandoned his Roman identity and fallen under the spell of a foreign queen. This rhetoric inflamed both the Senate and public opinion against Antony. In 31 before Christ, the dispute between the two was resolved in the famous naval battle of Actium, off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Agrippa, decisively defeated the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra, who fled to Egypt. The end was tragic and symbolic. Surrounded in Alexandria, with no hope of victory, Mark Antony and Cleopatra decided to end their lives in 30 before Christ. With their deaths, Octavian became the absolute master of Rome. This victory not only eliminated his last rival, but also brought to an end a cycle of civil wars that had devastated the Republic for almost a century. The following year, in 27 before Christ, Octavian was officially recognized by the Senate with the title of Augustus, becoming the first emperor of Rome. Thus, the alliance and passion between Mark Antony and Cleopatra, which sought to challenge Rome, became the episode that gave rise to the Roman Empire, bringing the Republican era to a definitive close. The naval battle of Actium, fought in 31 before Christ, was the decisive moment that ended more than 100 years of civil wars and paved the way for the birth of the Roman Empire. After years of rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian, the struggle for control of Rome culminated in one last massive confrontation. Octavian's fleet, masterfully commanded by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, faced the powerful alliance of Mark Antony and Queen Cleopatra of Egypt in the waters off the Greek coast. Octavian had a more disciplined and well-supplied fleet, while Antony's forces were numerous but heavier and less maneuverable. The battle was long, marked by tactical maneuvers of encirclement and resistance. At a critical moment, Cleopatra's fleet broke through the line and retreated toward the open sea, taking the Egyptian ships with her. Mark Antony, upon seeing this move, abandoned the battle to follow her. This sudden withdrawal shattered the cohesion of his forces and gave Octavian a definitive victory. After the defeat at Actium, Mark Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where a year later they were cornered by Octavian's forces. With no escape and facing the imminent humiliation of being captured and paraded in Rome, both chose to end their lives. Antony with his sword and Cleopatra, according to tradition, by allowing herself to be bitten by a venomous serpent. The couple's suicide marked the end of an era. Octavian annexed Egypt as a Roman province, incorporating its immense wealth and bringing under his direct control the most fertile agricultural region of the Mediterranean. With all his rivals defeated, Octavian returned to Rome as the sole holder of power. In 27 before Christ, the Senate granted him the honorific title of Augustus, recognizing his supreme authority. Although some republican forms and institutions were preserved as a facade, the reality was that Rome had been transformed into a centralized state governed by a single man. Thus was born the Principate, the first phase of the Roman Empire. Augustus did not call himself king or dictator, but princeps, the first among citizens, maintaining an appearance of collegiality, but in practice controlling all political, military, and administrative decisions. The victory at Actium and the rise of Augustus represent a historic milestone, the end of the Republic and the beginning of a new era. The absolute power concentrated in a single ruler brought stability after decades of violence, and that peace lasted long enough to allow Rome to expand its borders and consolidate an imperial system that would influence the entire history of the Western world. With Egypt under Roman control, wealth flowing in and a loyal army, Augustus became the model of a ruler who transformed Rome into the greatest power the ancient world had ever known. With the victory at Actium in the year 31 before Christ and the consolidation of his absolute power after the death of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian, now called Caesar Augustus, as of 27 before Christ, inaugurated a new era in the history of Rome. After more than 100 years of civil wars, political assassinations, and instability, the city finally entered a long period of peace that would become known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This was not merely the absence of internal war, but a deliberate political project of deep reorganization of the Roman world, bringing stability, wealth, and a new cultural brilliance. Augustus proved to be a master of administration. He kept the republican institutions as a facade, senate, magistracies, and assemblies, but in practice concentrated all power in his own hands. He assumed titles that gave him authority over the army, finances, and religion, ensuring that no important decision could be taken without his approval. His political skill lay in avoiding declaring himself king or dictator, terms the Romans despised, but instead presenting himself as princeps, the first citizen, someone who ruled in the name of order and the common good. This appearance of republican continuity, combined with the real centralization of power, created a balance that the Romans accepted after decades of chaos. Under Augustus, Rome experienced a surge of development and prosperity. He reorganized the army, transforming the legions into permanent and professional forces, with veterans settled in colonies along the frontiers. He created an efficient public administration with postal systems, infrastructure works, paved roads, and aqueducts that brought water to growing cities. He also sponsored grand architectural projects, temples, forums, and theaters that turned the capital into a monumental metropolis. His famous phrase, "I found Rome made of brick and left it made of marble," was not mere rhetoric. His urban policy reshaped the city. In the cultural sphere, the reign of Augustus marked the so-called Golden Age of Latin literature. Writers such as Virgil, author of the Aeneid, Horace, and Ovid, flourished under his patronage, helping to consolidate the image of Rome as heir to a destiny traced by the gods. The Pax Romana also strengthened commerce. With safe seas and roads, goods circulated from Hispania to Egypt and from Britannia to Syria. Stability brought a more predictable life for millions of inhabitants of the empire. Despite all the propaganda of peace, the Pax Romana was also maintained by force. Augustus expanded borders, annexed regions such as Egypt and parts of Germania, and suppressed revolts when necessary. But for the majority of citizens, the benefits of order outweighed the price of obedience. Thus, by the end of Augustus's rule in 14 after Christ, Rome had been transformed into a consolidated imperial state, respected and feared, living in a political balance that would serve as the foundation for the next 2 centuries. With the rise of Augustus and the inauguration of the Principate in 27 before Christ, Rome ceased to be merely an expanded city-state and became a unified empire governed by a complex administrative structure. The genius of Augustus lay in creating a system capable of controlling an immense territory that extended from Hispania to Egypt and from Germania to Syria, ensuring stability, efficiency, and continuity. The secret of this system was the combination of a republican appearance with absolute centralized power, maintaining the Senate and the magistracies, but placing under his authority all crucial decisions. One of Augustus's first measures was to reform the Senate, reducing the number of members, establishing stricter criteria for the admission of new senators, and restoring the dignity of this institution as an advisory body. However, the true reins of power were in the hands of the emperor. He created the Concilium Principis, a restricted council of trust, and concentrated in his hands the command of the army, the control of strategic provinces, and the authority to approve laws. At the same time, to prevent the entire empire from being governed only from Rome, Augustus established a clear division between senatorial provinces and imperial provinces. The former, more peaceful, were administered by governors appointed by the Senate. The latter, generally frontier and militarized regions, remained under the direct command of the emperor. Another important innovation was the creation of a permanent civil service. Augustus organized the Cursus Publicus, an official postal and transport network that connected all provinces, allowing fast communication between Rome and the most distant regions. He standardized the collection of taxes, creating a fiscal system that reduced corruption and increased revenue. He also invested in regular censuses of the population, an essential mechanism to control taxes, military resources, and statistics throughout the empire. In the cities, he instituted local magistracies that guaranteed a certain degree of municipal autonomy, but always under the supervision of imperial representatives. In the military sphere, Augustus definitively professionalized the legions, reducing their number but ensuring that they were composed of career soldiers, well-trained and loyal. He also created the Praetorian Guard, an elite force charged with protecting the emperor and the city of Rome. These military bodies became a powerful instrument both for defense and for maintaining internal order. In addition, he encouraged the founding of veteran colonies along the frontiers, establishing a Romanized population that helped secure control over newly conquered regions. This administrative organization transformed the empire into an efficient machine. By the end of Augustus's reign in 14 after Christ, Rome possessed a consolidated bureaucracy, secure communication routes, and a system of laws and taxes that ensured a constant flow of wealth to the capital. This model proved so solid that it continued to function even after his death, serving as the foundation for the emperors who succeeded him. Augustus, more than a conqueror, was a builder of systems. The order he established guaranteed 2 centuries of relative stability in what became known as the Pax Romana. During the reign of Augustus, especially between 27 before Christ and 14 after Christ, Rome underwent a transformation that affected not only politics and the administrative structure, but also the daily life of its inhabitants. The city became the capital of an empire, an urban center that gathered people from all parts of the Roman world. Italians, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Hispanics, Gauls, Africans, and many other peoples coexisted in the streets, creating an unprecedented cosmopolitan environment. This cultural diversity influenced customs, food, clothing, and even the language spoken in squares and markets. The reforms of Augustus and his policy of public works radically changed the appearance of the city. Temples, forums, aqueducts, public baths, and theaters were built. Wide paved streets began to connect the most populated neighborhoods, while new urban planning laws tried to organize a city that already exceeded 1 million inhabitants. In daily life, Romans lived between monumental splendor and the typical difficulties of an ancient metropolis: crowds, noise, traffic of carts, and in poorer areas, unhealthy conditions. To deal with these problems, the emperor instituted a system of free grain distribution for the poorest population, known as the annona, which guaranteed the basic food supply for thousands of families. Social life revolved around public spaces, The Forum was the political and economic center, where people went to trade, attend speeches, and resolve legal matters. Public baths, or thermae, became places of leisure, hygiene, and socializing, open to all social classes. There, Romans spent hours talking, exercising, receiving massages, and enjoying heated pools. Another very popular form of entertainment was the spectacles, chariot races at the Circus Maximus, theatrical plays, musical performances, and above all, gladiatorial games in the amphitheater. These activities, sponsored by the state or wealthy citizens, had a clear political role to entertain the population and reinforce the image of the empire's greatness. In private life, there was a clear social division. The wealthiest lived in spacious houses, the domus, decorated with mosaics and internal gardens. Most of the population, however, lived in multi-story collective buildings called insulae, which were often dangerous, with risks of fires and collapses. Food for the poor was simple, based on bread, porridge, and olive oil, while the rich could afford banquets with exotic dishes from all over the empire. Clothing also marked differences. The tunic was the most common garment, but Roman citizens wore the toga on formal occasions, a symbol of status. This coexistence of wealth and poverty, luxury and simplicity, was balanced by the idea that everyone was part of the same city that now ruled the known world. Daily life in the time of Augustus, therefore, reflected Rome's transition from a turbulent republic to a stable and organized empire, with opportunities and tensions that would shape urban culture for centuries to come. When Augustus died in 14 after Christ, after more than 40 years of rule, Rome faced a decisive moment. For the first time, the empire would have to continue without the man who had founded it. Despite having maintained the appearance of republican institutions, Augustus had centralized all power in himself, and succession was not formally established by law. Thus, the emperor spent years planning who would be his heir, choosing among family members and closest allies. After the death of his younger potential successors, such as Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Augustus finally decided to adopt Tiberius, his stepson, as his son and successor. Tiberius took the throne in 14 after Christ and became the second emperor of Rome, officially inaugurating the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty. This dynasty received its name from the combination of the two most important clans linked to Augustus, the Julii, from whom Augustus came, and the Claudii, to which Tiberius belonged by birth. Tiberius was an experienced and capable general, known for his military victories in Germania and Pannonia, but he had a reserved, distrustful, and austere temperament. At the beginning of his reign, he maintained the policies created by Augustus, guaranteeing stability and prosperity, but over time his relationship with the Senate and with the population deteriorated. He preferred to spend long periods away from the capital, in Capri, leaving the administration in the hands of his advisors, which opened the door to intrigues and corruption. The Julio-Claudian dynasty would remain in power for almost a century, marked by rulers with very different and often controversial personalities. After Tiberius, power would pass to Caligula, a young man who was initially very popular, but ended up being known for his eccentricity and cruelty. After his violent death, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, took the throne, surprising everyone by showing administrative competence and expanding the empire by conquering regions such as Britannia. Then Nero, the adopted son of Claudius, would end the dynasty with a reign marked by scandals, persecutions, and a great fire that devastated Rome in the year 64 after Christ. Nero's death, in 68, would open a new turbulent phase known as the Year of the Four Emperors. The choice of Tiberius as successor and the creation of a dynastic line made it clear that, although the republican facade still existed, imperial power had in fact become hereditary. By carefully preparing this transition, Augustus ensured that his work would not disappear with his death. What he created was no longer a republic. It was an empire that was now to be governed as a monarchy, in fact, even if disguised under ancient institutions. Thus the era of the Roman emperors had officially begun. Tiberius, immediate successor of Augustus, assumed power in 14 after Christ, in a setting that mixed stability with high expectations. An experienced general and a politician with an austere character, he did not possess the same charisma as his adoptive father, but he inherited a rich, organized, and secure empire. In the first years of his rule, He proved to be an efficient administrator and a cautious commander, preferring to consolidate the empire's borders instead of seeking risky conquests. This pragmatic approach marked his entire reign and was responsible for keeping order for almost 2 decades. In military matters, Tiberius concentrated his efforts on the frontiers of the Rhine and the Danube, strategic regions that still faced constant threats from Germanic and Thracian tribes. He reorganized defenses, strengthened fortifications, and positioned legions permanently, creating a stable frontier system that would be the basis for later emperors. Tiberius also dealt with internal revolts, such as the mutiny of legions after Augustus's death, which he managed to suppress firmly. Unlike Augustus, he avoided major expansionist campaigns, believing that consolidating borders was more beneficial for the long-term security of the empire. This decision ensured peace in most provinces during his rule. In civil administration, Tiberius maintained the state machinery created by Augustus, reinforcing the tax system, guaranteeing grain distribution, and promoting justice. He saved public resources, accumulating a considerable reserve in the imperial treasury. However, his closed personality and aversion to public life created an image of coldness. Over the years, his relationship with the Senate became increasingly tense, as he preferred to delegate tasks and avoided direct participation in political debates. This distance was interpreted as arrogance and increased the climate of distrust among the senatorial elite. The final years of Tiberius were marked by darker episodes. Disillusioned with politics and the intrigues of Rome, he withdrew to the island of Capri, from where he governed at a distance. During this period, the influence of his advisors grew, especially that of the feared Praetorian prefect Sejanus, who ruled practically in his name for years until he was accused of conspiracy and executed. This physical and emotional detachment from the capital left deep marks on his reputation. Nevertheless, Tiberius died in 37 after Christ, leaving behind a stable, well-administered, and well-defended empire. The legacy of Tiberius is ambiguous. He was not a beloved emperor nor a brilliant conqueror like Augustus, but he was a prudent ruler who strengthened the foundations of imperial power and demonstrated that the empire could function even without the charismatic presence of its founder. However, his lack of closeness with the people and the Senate caused his image to be portrayed by later historians as that of a cold, calculating, and distrustful man, opening the way for a radical contrast with his successor Caligula. When Tiberius died in 37 after Christ, the empire passed to Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known by his nickname Caligula. The son of the popular general Germanicus and great-grandson of Augustus, Caligula was received in Rome with enormous enthusiasm. Young, charismatic, and seen as the legitimate heir of the Julio-Claudian lineage, he brought hope of renewal after the austere and distant years of Tiberius's government. In the first months of his reign, this expectation seemed to be confirmed. Caligula abolished oppressive political trials, distributed bonuses to soldiers, reduced taxes, held lavish games and spectacles, and gained popular sympathy. However, only a few months after taking power, Caligula fell gravely ill, and upon recovery, his personality changed drastically. Ancient historians report that from this moment on, he began to exhibit increasingly erratic, eccentric, and cruel behavior. Caligula started to spend immense sums from the imperial treasury on parties, luxurious constructions, and extravagant spectacles. He built temporary floating bridges to cross on horseback, ordered golden statues of himself, and demanded to be worshipped as a living deity, something that affronted Roman traditions. Legendary episodes, such as allegedly wanting to appoint his horse Incitatus as consul, emerged from this period and illustrate the image of an emperor disconnected from reality. Besides his eccentricities, Caligula demonstrated violent and unpredictable behavior. He ordered the execution of senators for trivial reasons, confiscated the property of aristocrats, and increased the power of his personal guard, the Praetorian Guard, becoming increasingly feared. In the provinces, he undertook some military campaigns with no significant results, such as an expedition to northern Germania and the failed project to invade Britannia. These episodes increased the dissatisfaction of the legions and the political elite, who saw him as a risk to the stability of the empire. The growing tyranny and instability created a climate of conspiracy. In 41 after Christ, only 4 years after assuming the throne, Caligula was assassinated in Rome in an ambush organized by members of the Praetorian Guard who feared they might be eliminated by the emperor himself. His death was followed by chaos in the imperial palace until the guard found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding and proclaimed him emperor. This episode marked the first time that a Roman emperor was assassinated by his own protectors, a dangerous precedent that showed how fragile imperial power could be when it depended on the loyalty of soldiers. Caligula went down in history as an extreme example of abuse of power, instability, and the dangers of a government centered solely on the figure of the emperor. Although some of his attitudes may have been exaggerated or distorted by hostile chroniclers, it is undeniable that his rule shook the confidence in the stability inaugurated by Augustus and paved the way for a new, more controlled style of government that would emerge under Claudius, his successor. After the assassination of Caligula in the year 41 after Christ, the imperial succession took an unexpected turn. Amid the chaos in the palace, the Praetorian Guards found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain, fearing for his life. Until then, he had been considered a weak man, stammering with little involvement in politics, and had never been taken seriously by the Roman aristocracy. However, the soldiers, perhaps seeing him as a manipulable figure or simply seeking immediate stability, proclaimed him emperor. This decision surprised both the Senate and the population, but it became a turning point. Claudius would govern Rome from 41 to 54 after Christ, proving to be a much more competent leader than anyone had imagined. Claudius was a scholar, passionate about history, languages, and administration. As soon as he took power, he worked to strengthen imperial institutions, reform the bureaucracy, and expand the participation of provincial citizens in political life, an attitude that displeased part of the traditional elite, but brought the empire closer to its conquered territories. He invested in large public works, such as aqueducts, roads, and ports, modernizing Rome's infrastructure and facilitating trade throughout the empire. One of his greatest achievements was the construction of the port of Ostia, which ensured a regular supply of grain for the capital. In the military field, Claudius made a bold decision. He launched the conquest of Britannia, a territory that had been the target of Julius Caesar's frustrated attempts but remained outside Roman control. In 43 after Christ, his legions landed on the island and began a campaign that would result in the incorporation of Britannia into the empire, at least in its southern part. This conquest brought immense wealth, new resources, and great prestige to Claudius, consolidating his image as an active emperor capable of expanding the empire's frontiers. He even traveled to the island to personally oversee the advances and celebrate victory, reinforcing his legitimacy before the army. Despite these achievements, his personal life was marked by scandals and palace intrigues. Claudius had several wives, and his marriages were often used as political tools. Among them, the marriage to Agrippina the Younger stands out, as it placed her son Nero at the center of power. Nero would later be adopted by Claudius and eventually inherit the throne. Many ancient historians accuse Agrippina of having poisoned Claudius in 54 after Christ to hasten Nero's rise to power, although no conclusive evidence ever proved this. Claudius's rule demonstrated that an underestimated emperor could, in fact, be an efficient administrator and a skillful political strategist. His extension of Roman citizenship to the provinces and the inclusion of local elites in the Senate gave the empire a broader base of support. By the end of his reign, Rome was richer, more connected, and more extensive thanks to the conquest of Britannia. His death opened the way for a period that would begin with promise, but would ultimately descend into scandal and chaos under his successor, Nero. Nero, whose full name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, became emperor in 54 after Christ, still very young after the death of Claudius, from whom he had been adopted. His government began with great expectations, especially because during his first years he was under the guidance of two talented men, the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. Under their supervision, the beginning of his reign was relatively balanced. Nero proved to be a popular ruler, reducing taxes, organizing games and races, and seeking to please the masses. However, as he gained more autonomy and freed himself from the influence of his advisors, his personality began to reveal egocentric, passionate, and unpredictable tendencies, turning his government into one of the most controversial in Roman history. Nero was obsessed with the arts. Unlike previous emperors, he did not see himself as a military leader, but as an artist and performer. He sang, played the lyre, and took part in public competitions, something deeply despised by the Roman elite, who considered such behavior unworthy of an emperor. Fascinated by Greek culture, Nero promoted spectacles and festivals, often making himself the main attraction. This behavior, which pleased part of the people, completely alienated the Senate and the nobles, who viewed his attitude as an affront to traditional values. The most striking episode of his reign was the Great Fire of Rome, which occurred in the year 64 after Christ. The fire devastated much of the city for several days, destroying entire neighborhoods and leaving thousands homeless. The exact causes were never proven, but rumors at the time claimed that Nero himself had ordered the fire to clear space for the construction of a monumental new palace, the Domus Aurea. Although probably exaggerated, these accusations were fueled by the emperor's conduct during the tragedy, described by chroniclers as indifferent or even artistic, with legendary accounts that he played the lyre while watching the flames. To divert suspicion, Nero blamed the Christians, a small and little-known sect at the time, and initiated one of the first organized persecutions against them. After the fire, Nero rebuilt Rome with wide avenues and planned buildings, but his government spiraled into instability. He executed political rivals, both real and imagined, and even members of his own family, such as his mother Agrippina, his wife Octavia, and close advisors. This series of assassinations and persecutions created an atmosphere of terror among the Roman elite. In the provinces, revolts began to break out, and confidence in the emperor dissolved. In 68 after Christ, the legions in Hispania and Gaul revolted. The Senate declared him a public enemy, and Nero, abandoned by everyone, took his own life, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's legacy is marked by extremes. He was an emperor who, while sponsoring grand works in the arts, plunged Rome into political chaos and bloody persecutions. His death left a power vacuum that resulted in one of the most turbulent years in Roman history, the so-called Year of the Four Emperors, and definitively ended the era of Augustus's descendants on the throne. After Nero's death in 68 after Christ, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end, and the Roman Empire plunged into an unprecedented crisis. Without a direct heir, and with central authority collapsing, the legions began to play a decisive role in choosing the emperor. For the first time in the history of the empire, succession was no longer decided by the Senate or by a clear dynastic line, but by military force. This period, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, was marked by instability, civil battles, and rapid changes of power until a new leader finally emerged capable of restoring order. The first to assume the throne was Galba, governor of the province of Hispania. He was proclaimed emperor by his legions and supported by the Senate, which saw in him a disciplinarian figure after Nero's excesses. However, Galba proved inflexible and unpopular, refusing to reward the legions that had supported him and cutting benefits. His rigidity made him vulnerable to conspiracies, and just 7 months after taking power, in January of 69 after Christ, he was assassinated in an ambush in the Forum by members of his own Praetorian Guard. Next, Otho, who had conspired against Galba, was proclaimed emperor. More flexible and generous with the soldiers, he immediately gained support in Rome. However, in the Germanic provinces, the legions had proclaimed another candidate, Vitellius. Vitellius's forces quickly advanced through Italy and defeated Otho at the Battle of Bedriacum. With no alternative, Otho chose to commit suicide, preferring to avoid further bloodshed. Vitellius then assumed the throne, but his government was short and disastrous. Known for his luxurious and unruly lifestyle, he quickly lost the confidence of the legions in the east, which proclaimed Vespasian, the commander responsible for the war in Judea, as the new emperor. Supported by powerful forces and a network of alliances in Egypt and the east, Vespasian marched on Rome. In December of 69 after Christ, his troops defeated Vitellius in a second battle at Bedriacum, invaded Rome, and killed the emperor, bringing an end to a chaotic year. The victory of Vespasian marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty and restored stability. This episode clearly showed that from that moment on, the power of the legions was the real foundation of imperial authority. The Year of the Four Emperors exposed the fragility of the succession system. and the importance of charismatic generals, revealing that in times of crisis, Rome could be ruled by any man capable of gaining sufficient military support. Vespasian's rise would open a new chapter in Rome's history, bringing a period of reorganization and reconstruction after years of chaos. With the definitive victory in 69 after Christ and the death of Vitellius, Vespasian took power and founded the Flavian dynasty, putting an end to the turbulent year of the four emperors. Vespasian was a man of humbler origin compared to his predecessors, an experienced general who had earned fame in the campaigns in Britannia and above all in Judea, where he was leading a difficult war against Jewish rebels when he was proclaimed emperor by his legions. His rise brought stability and inaugurated a period of reorganization, pragmatism and recovery after years of political and financial crises. Vespasian had a practical profile, averse to excesses and personal luxuries. His first mission was to restore the finances of the empire, deeply shaken by Nero's reckless spending and the civil wars. To achieve this, he increased tax collection and implemented strict cuts in public spending, measures that, although unpopular in some sectors, made it possible to balance the treasury and finance essential public works. Unlike Nero and Caligula, who sought to impress with grandiose spectacles for personal display, Vespasian viewed public works as investments meant to benefit the city and reinforce imperial authority. One of his most famous initiatives was the beginning of the construction of the Flavian Amphitheatre, better known by its popular name, the Colosseum. The Colosseum began to be built in 70 after Christ on the site of Nero's former palace, the Domus Aurea, as a clear political gesture, to give back to the people of Rome an area that had been privatized for the exclusive use of the previous emperor. The work was financed largely with the spoils of the war in Judea, and would later become the greatest symbol of Roman power and culture. The amphitheatre was designed to host tens of thousands of spectators for gladiatorial spectacles, hunts, and even reconstructions of naval battles, serving both as entertainment and political propaganda. In addition to the Colosseum, Vespasian promoted other important infrastructure projects, including the construction of roads, aqueducts, and the restoration of public buildings damaged by internal conflicts. He also strengthened the empire's frontiers, ensuring stability in the most sensitive provinces, and completed the war in Judea, a conflict that ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 after Christ by his son Titus. Vespasian ruled firmly until his death in 79 after Christ, when he was succeeded by Titus, the first biological heir to take power peacefully after decades of bloody successions. Vespasian's legacy is that of an emperor who restored stability and discipline to the empire, creating a new dynasty that replaced the excesses of previous generations with an administration based on realism and public service. His decision to build the Colosseum in the heart of Rome was not only architectural but symbolic. The idea that the emperor and the city belonged to the people, not just to the elite, something that earned the Flavians great popularity. Titus Flavius, the eldest son of Vespasian, took the throne of the Roman Empire in the year 79 after Christ, following his father's death, and although his reign lasted only 2 years, it was marked by historical events of enormous impact. Even before becoming emperor, Titus had already achieved fame as a general, mainly for leading the Roman forces during the war in Judea, a conflict that culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish temple in the year 70 after Christ. This episode, one of the most dramatic in ancient history, had profound consequences not only for the Jews who lost their religious center, but also for the consolidation of Roman power in the East. During the siege of Jerusalem, Titus demonstrated military discipline and relentless determination. The city resisted with great courage for months, even in the face of hunger and extreme deprivation. When the legions finally broke through the walls, a massacre followed. Thousands of inhabitants were killed, and the temple, the spiritual heart of Judaism, was set on fire and destroyed. This act symbolized Rome's ultimate victory and was immortalized in the Arch of Titus, later erected in the Roman Forum to celebrate the triumph. The gold looted from the temple would help finance monumental works such as the Colosseum. This event marked the end of Judea's political autonomy, which came to be administered directly by Roman governors. When Titus became emperor, his main concern was to consolidate the legacy left by his father, maintaining the administrative balance and discipline that had been restored after decades of civil wars. His reign, however, was tested by two great tragedies. The first was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 after Christ, which destroyed entire cities such as Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabiae, burying thousands of people under ashes and lava. Titus personally organized relief operations and provided financial aid to the victims, an action that earned him great respect and admiration. Shortly afterward, a devastating fire struck Rome, destroying entire neighborhoods. Once again, he coordinated reconstruction efforts, showing genuine concern for the well-being of the population. The most symbolic event of his short reign was the official inauguration of the Colosseum in 80 after Christ. The ceremony lasted 100 days, with grand spectacles that included gladiatorial combats, hunts, and even mock naval battles staged inside the arena, which was specially prepared to be flooded. The Colosseum became the greatest symbol of Roman entertainment and the power of the Flavians, and by presiding over these games, Titus consolidated his image as an emperor close to the people. Despite the calamities faced, Titus achieved enormous popularity. The Romans called him the love and delight of the human race, a rare expression for a ruler. His premature death in 81 after Christ caused widespread sorrow. With no children, he was succeeded by his brother Domitian, ensuring the continuity of the Flavian dynasty. Thus, Titus went down in history as a warrior emperor, and at the same time, a benevolent one, whose greatest marks were the victory in Jerusalem and the inauguration of one of the most iconic monuments of ancient Rome. Domitian, the younger brother of Titus and the last emperor of the Flavian dynasty, ascended the throne in the year 81 after Christ and ruled until 96 after Christ. His government, one of the longest of the first century, consolidated a phase of strengthening imperial power, marked by major public works, administrative reforms, and at the same time by an authoritarian style that earned him many enemies. Unlike his father Vespasian and his brother Titus, who sought to balance relations with the Senate, Domitian stood out for his autocratic posture, concentrating more power in himself and reducing the importance of republican institutions. One of the hallmarks of his reign was an intense program of construction. He completed parts of the Colosseum begun by his predecessors, built temples, stadiums, and palaces that transformed the urban landscape of Rome. Among his most famous works is the Stadium of Domitian, which would become the model for today's Piazza Navona. He also restored and reinforced the empire's frontier defenses, especially along the Rhine and the Danube, confronting Germanic tribes and consolidating defensive lines that proved vital to Roman stability for decades. His rule also saw significant victories against the Dacians and other peoples, although these conflicts consumed considerable resources. Administratively, Domitian was an efficient manager. He reformed the tax system, fought corruption, strengthened the census, and encouraged agriculture. However, his relationship with the Senate deteriorated rapidly, as he ruled with little willingness for dialogue and preferred to rely on close advisors and the Praetorian Guard. This authoritarian behavior created an atmosphere of fear and political tension, aggravated by frequent accusations of conspiracy. Domitian began to execute or exile opponents, leading to a climate of suspicion and repression among the Roman elite. As the years passed, his rule became increasingly unpopular among senators, although he remained relatively stable and even popular among the soldiers and the people. In 96 after Christ, a palace conspiracy, formed by members of the court and possibly with the support of Praetorian Guard officers, assassinated Domitian inside the imperial palace. His death ended the Flavian dynasty and paved the way for the Senate to choose a new emperor, seeking to restore balance after years of extreme centralization. Despite his violent end, Domitian's reign left a lasting legacy. He consolidated the frontiers, kept the empire's finances stable, and continued to transform Rome into a monumental capital. At the same time, his figure went down in history with a reputation for tyranny and mistrust, a reflection of the permanent tension between the personal authority of emperors and the old republican traditions that still survived as a shadow in the heart of the empire. With the assassination of Domitian in 96 after Christ, the Flavian dynasty came to an end, and the Senate, seeking to restore balance after years of authoritarian rule, chose a new emperor, Marcus Cocceius Nerva. This act marked the beginning of the Nervan Antonine dynasty and inaugurated a period considered by historians as the era of the five good emperors who ruled between the years 96 and 180 after Christ: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. This period became known for its stability, prosperity, and the relatively balanced way in which these emperors governed, choosing their successors through adoption based on merit rather than blood ties. Nerva, already elderly when he assumed power, ruled for only 2 years, but his short reign was essential for establishing a new principle of succession. He adopted Trajan, a respected general, ensuring a smooth transition and gaining the trust of the legions. Trajan, who assumed power in 98 after Christ, is remembered as one of the greatest emperors in Roman history. Under his command, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia, modern-day Romania, and adding immense wealth to the Roman treasury. Trajan also promoted major public works such as roads, aqueducts, and the magnificent Forum of Trajan in Rome, which included the famous Trajan's Column. After Trajan, Hadrian assumed power in 118 after Christ and was responsible for consolidating the empire's frontiers. Unlike his predecessor, he preferred to reinforce the borders rather than expand them, building fortifications that became iconic, such as Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Hadrian also traveled extensively throughout the empire, something unprecedented for an emperor, personally inspecting the provinces and promoting Greek culture, which he greatly admired. His rule strengthened provincial administration and encouraged the cultural integration of the empire. Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 after Christ, brought an even deeper period of peace. His reign, marked by the absence of major wars, focused on legal improvements, public charity, and the construction of temples and infrastructure. Under his rule, Rome experienced rare prosperity and consolidated a period of internal stability that seemed unshakable. Finally, Marcus Aurelius, known as the Philosopher Emperor, ruled from 161 to 180 after Christ. Deeply influenced by Stoicism, he faced more difficult times, with wars on the Danube frontier and a terrible epidemic that devastated the empire. Even so, he maintained a firm stance and wrote philosophical reflections that became classic works. At the end of his life, however, he broke with tradition by adopting his son Commodus as his successor, a choice that would have disastrous consequences. The period of the five good emperors is considered the phase of greatest prosperity and stability in ancient Rome. Under these rulers, the empire reached its peak in terms of territory, culture, and economy, consolidating a political system in which the adoption of competent leaders proved far more effective than blind heredity. This golden age would, however, be followed by darker times when Commodus took the throne and ushered in a period of decline. Trajan, adopted by Nerva and emperor from the year 98 after Christ onward, entered history as the ruler who brought the Roman Empire to its greatest territorial height. Born in Hispania, he was a skilled military commander, pragmatic and, at the same time, a visionary administrator. His rise brought renewed energy to the imperial machine, with a clear focus on expansion, public works, and administrative justice. He became known among the Romans as Optimus Princeps, the best of princes, a title that reflected the admiration of both the people and the Senate. The greatest military achievement of Trajan was the Dacian Wars, fought between 101 and 106 after Christ. Dacia, located in what is now Romania, posed a constant threat to the Danube frontiers, with warlike tribes led by King Decebalus. These campaigns were long and difficult, requiring immense bridges and fortifications, but they ended with the complete annexation of the region. This victory not only eliminated a dangerous enemy, but also enriched Rome with Dacia's vast mineral resources, especially gold and silver, which financed a wave of public construction. To commemorate this, Trajan erected the famous Trajan's Column, a spiral monument with detailed scenes of these battles, which remains one of the icons of ancient Rome to this day. After the conquest of Dacia, Trajan turned his attention to the east. Between 113 and 117 after Christ, he launched a campaign against the Parthian Empire, one of Rome's greatest rivals. In this offensive, he conquered Armenia, Mesopotamia, and advanced as far as the Persian Gulf. At this moment, Rome reached the greatest territorial extension in its history, from the Atlantic in Hispania to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates in what is now Iraq. Although these conquests in the east proved difficult to maintain and some of them were lost after his death, the feat demonstrated Rome's ability to project power over vast distances. In addition to his military campaigns, Trajan was admired for his commitment to the welfare of the empire. He promoted an impressive program of public works. He built roads, aqueducts, baths, markets, and especially the Forum of Trajan in Rome, one of the most monumental architectural works of the ancient world. He also created a social assistance program called Alimenta, aimed at providing food and educational support to poor children, showing a genuine concern for citizens. Trajan's reign represented the peak of Roman power, combining extraordinary military conquests with efficient administration. His death, in 117 after Christ, during the return from his last campaign, left an empire richer and more vast than ever. His successor, Hadrian, adopted heir, would choose to consolidate and reorganize this vast territory, starting a new phase focused less on expansion and more on border protection. When Hadrian ascended the throne in 117 after Christ, succeeding his adoptive father Trajan, he inherited a gigantic empire, the largest Rome had ever controlled. However, unlike Trajan, who sought expansive conquests, Hadrian adopted a much more cautious policy. Instead of expanding borders, he decided to consolidate them. This choice represented a fundamental strategic shift. Hadrian believed that the size of the empire had reached a critical point where expansion would bring more weakness than benefits, and his priority became to strengthen the limits and create permanent defenses. Among all his measures, the most famous was the construction of Hadrian's Wall in Britannia. This immense project began in 122 after Christ and stretched for about 120 kilometers from the North Sea to the Irish Sea in the region that today corresponds to northern England. The wall was not just a physical barrier, but a complex defensive system with forts, watchtowers, and gates, intended to control the movement of people and goods and to protect the Roman province from incursions by northern tribes, especially the Picts of Caledonia, modern Scotland. Beyond being a military structure, it served as a powerful symbol of power, a constant reminder, both to the Romans and to the local peoples, of the presence and authority of Rome. Hadrian's policy was not limited to Britannia. He spent much of his reign personally traveling through the provinces, something unprecedented until then. He visited distant regions such as Hispania, Gaul, Africa, Asia Minor, and Egypt, inspecting troops, public works, and resolving local disputes. These travels brought the emperor closer to the provinces, reinforcing the cultural and political integration of the empire. During these stays, Hadrian sponsored construction projects, fortresses, and cities, many of which prospered for centuries thanks to the impetus they received. In addition to his administrative skills, Hadrian was passionate about Greek culture. He encouraged the arts, philosophy, and architecture, leaving significant marks both in Rome and in Athens, where he sponsored temples and public buildings. This passion for the Greek world earned him the nickname Graculus, Little Greek, among some more conservative Romans. He also strengthened the legal system, improved provincial administration, and developed social policies that continued Trajan's programs. Despite some important revolts, such as the Second Great Jewish Uprising, known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, between 132 and 135 after Christ, which ended with the devastation of Judea, Hadrian's reign was a period of relative internal stability. When he died in 138 after Christ, he left an empire more secure, better structured, and prepared to face the future. His vision of consolidating rather than expanding would be fundamental to the survival of the empire in the following decades. When Hadrian died in 138 after Christ, he left, as his adopted successor, Titus Aurelius Antoninus, known in history as Antoninus Pius. The cognomen Pius was given to him in recognition of his devotion to honoring the memory and wishes of Hadrian, as well as for his balanced and just character. Antoninus ruled until 161 after Christ and is remembered as one of the most peaceful, prosperous, and just emperors in the history of Rome, playing a fundamental role in the period known as the era of the Five Good Emperors. The reign of Antoninus Pius was notable precisely because of the absence of major wars. Unlike Trajan, who expanded, and Hadrian, who consolidated and fortified the frontiers, Antoninus managed to maintain the stability of the empire almost without the need for large-scale military campaigns. This tranquility was the result of decades of previous administrative organization and efficient diplomacy. His rule was marked by a rare internal balance. The frontiers remained secure, with few rebellions, and the relations between Rome and its dominated peoples were relatively peaceful. In more distant regions, such as in Britannia, Antoninus still carried out important defensive works, including the construction of the so-called Antonine Wall, located further north than Hadrian's Wall, although it was later abandoned. Without large wars to consume resources, Antoninus focused his efforts on internal administration. He reformed the judicial system, making the application of laws more uniform throughout the empire, encouraged public works such as roads, temples, and aqueducts, and invested in urban improvements. He also reinforced support for education, the arts, and architecture, keeping alive the cultural brilliance of the previous period. His economic policy was characterized by prudence. He preserved the public treasury, maintained fair taxes, and managed to balance expenses with reserves, creating a financially healthy empire. One of the most remarkable aspects of Antoninus's reign was his posture as a ruler. He was known for his serenity, justice, and firmness, preferring to resolve conflicts through diplomacy and negotiation rather than through the hasty use of force. This way of governing reinforced the trust of the subjects and created a sense of security and continuity. For all these reasons, the era of Antoninus Pius is considered a true peak of prosperity and stability in Roman history. When he died in 161 after Christ, Antoninus left the throne to his adopted son Marcus Aurelius, whom he had carefully prepared to govern. With his death ended one of the most peaceful periods of the Roman Empire, and Rome would go on to face new challenges under the philosopher-emperor, who would rule in much more turbulent times. Marcus Aurelius, who ascended the throne in 161 after Christ after the death of Antoninus Pius, is remembered as the philosopher-emperor, a ruler who united the wisdom of Stoicism with leadership in times of great crisis. From a young age, Marcus Aurelius was educated in philosophy, rhetoric, and law, becoming one of the most cultured men of his time. Unlike many previous emperors, he did not seek military glory or luxury, but balance and reason as the guiding principles of his government. However, his reign was marked by difficult times, with constant external threats and one of the worst epidemics Rome had ever faced. Unlike his predecessors, Marcus Aurelius decided to govern jointly with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, creating a co-regency unprecedented up to that time. Early on, they faced the so-called Antonine Plague, a devastating pandemic that spread throughout the empire for almost 15 years, claiming millions of lives and weakening the economy. Despite the tragedy, Marcus Aurelius remained steadfast, organizing public assistance and striving to keep the state functioning. In the military sphere, the emperor faced challenges especially along the Danube and Rhine frontiers. Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, taking advantage of the weakness caused by the epidemic, began to invade Roman territories. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign in northern campaigns, personally leading the troops. The so-called Marcomannic Wars were long and exhausting, but vital to contain the invasions and preserve the integrity of the empire. During these campaigns, Marcus Aurelius showed great leadership and resilience, even spending most of his time in military camps. Despite these adversities, he never abandoned his commitment to philosophy. In the midst of the wars, he wrote his famous Meditations, a set of personal reflections influenced by Stoicism, in which he speaks about duty, the transience of life, the importance of virtue, and serenity in the face of difficulties. This work, written without any intention of publication, would become one of the most celebrated texts of ancient philosophy and a timeless guide to practical ethics. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 after Christ, leaving an empire more worn down than he had received, but still standing thanks to his effort. Contrary to the tradition of the previous good emperors, he broke with the practice of adopting the most capable successor and handed the throne to his biological son, Commodus, a choice that would mark the end of the Golden Age and the beginning of a period of instability. Marcus Aurelius is remembered as a leader who, even in times of great difficulties, ruled with discipline, wisdom, and a deep sense of moral responsibility. With the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 after Christ, the empire came to be ruled by his biological son, Lucius Aurelius Commodus. This succession marked a decisive rupture with the tradition that had guaranteed the stability of the Nerva Antonine dynasty, the selection of successors by adoption, based on merit and ability to govern. Commodus, still very young when he assumed power, had a personality completely different from that of his father. While Marcus Aurelius was austere, disciplined, and guided by Stoic philosophy, Commodus preferred luxury, pleasures, and personal fame, showing from the very beginning little willingness to face the responsibilities of the throne. In the early years of his reign, Commodus enjoyed a relative peace, inherited from his father's military victories and administrative stability. However, he soon abandoned the campaigns on the Danube frontier and returned to Rome, leaving the defense of the empire in the hands of his generals. This decision undermined the discipline of the legions and increased pressure on the borders. Commodus showed more interest in presenting himself as a gladiator in the arena than in governing, even participating in public combats, something considered scandalous for an emperor. This passion for spectacles and for his own image was used as propaganda to bring him closer to the masses, but it completely alienated the Roman elite. His government was marked by political intrigues, conspiracies, and an atmosphere of instability. Suspicious of everyone, Commodus began executing senators, nobles, and even trusted associates under suspicion of treason. At the same time, he promoted a cult of his own personality, going so far as to proclaim himself a reborn Hercules and to rename Rome as Colony of Commodus. This mixture of egocentrism, instability, and violence weakened the institutions that his father had kept strong even in times of crisis. On the economic front, the waste and luxury of the court created financial pressures, while corruption spread throughout all levels of administration. Conspirators within the palace itself, including his mistress Marcia and the chief of the Praetorian Guard, organized a plot to eliminate him. In the year 192 after Christ, Commodus was strangled in his chambers after an initial attempt to poison him failed. His death brought an end to the Nerva Antonine dynasty and plunged the empire into a new period of instability. The rule of Commodus symbolizes the closing of the golden age of the Roman Empire. The stability and prosperity that marked the period of the 5 good emperors were replaced by a chaotic reign, centered on the figure of an unstable emperor unable to manage the challenges of the empire. With his death, Rome entered the turbulent 3rd century, a period marked by military, economic, and political crises that would put to the test the very survival of the empire. The death of Commodus in 192 after Christ opened a new and dark phase in the history of the Roman Empire, known as the crisis of the 3rd century. This period, which extended approximately from 193 to 284 after Christ, was marked by an almost uninterrupted succession of civil wars, external invasions, economic collapse, and profound political instability. The main characteristic of this era was the so-called military anarchy. Emperors ceased to be chosen based on merit or clear succession, and instead began to be proclaimed by the legions themselves, who frequently overthrew and assassinated those they had just placed on the throne. This instability resulted in dozens of rulers within just a few decades, many of them governing for very short periods. The beginning of this crisis can be symbolized by the turbulent year of the 5 emperors in 193 after Christ, when different generals fought for the throne after the death of Pertinax, assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. From this dispute emerged Septimius Severus, founder of the Severan dynasty, who tried to restore military discipline and expanded the privileges of the army. Although he achieved important victories in Mesopotamia and Africa, his policies created an empire even more dependent on the soldiers, increasing the power of the legions over the government. After the death of Severus, the empire came to be ruled by his descendants, including Caracalla, famous for granting Roman citizenship to practically all free inhabitants of the empire, but also for his cruelty and instability. The assassination of Caracalla in 217 after Christ plunged Rome into another wave of internal disputes. In the years that followed, the situation only worsened. Between the years 235 and 284 after Christ, in less than 50 years, more than 20 different emperors came to power, many of them assassinated by rivals or by their own troops. Meanwhile, the empire's frontiers were under constant attack. In the north, the Germanic peoples carried out increasingly deep invasions. In the east, a new and powerful enemy emerged, the Sassanid Empire, which replaced the Parthians and inflicted heavy defeats on the Romans, even capturing Emperor Valerian in 260 after Christ, one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. Internally, the economy collapsed. Inflation soared, trade weakened, currency lost value, and epidemics devastated the population, drastically reducing manpower and the number of soldiers. The crisis of the 3rd century reached a point where the empire nearly fragmented. Temporary independent states emerged, such as the Gallic Empire in the west and the Kingdom of Palmyra in the east, which broke away from Roman authority. Only after a series of reorganization efforts, toward the end of the century, did Rome begin to regain a measure of stability. This period made it abundantly clear that the traditional Roman system of government was exhausted and that only a profound restructuring could save the empire from definitive collapse. The crisis of the 3rd century was a watershed moment. It revealed that the traditional model of Roman governance was no longer sustainable and that only deep reform could rescue the empire from ruin. When Diocletian took the throne in 284 after Christ, the Roman Empire was devastated by the crisis of the 3rd century. For almost 50 years, Rome had suffered a succession of murdered emperors, weak frontiers, rebellious provinces, constant invasions, and an economic collapse that threatened to completely disintegrate imperial unity. Diocletian, a general of humble origins, understood that no single person could control such a vast and vulnerable territory. His answer was one of the most radical political reforms in Roman history, the creation of the Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy, established in 293 after Christ, divided the empire into 4 parts, each governed by an emperor. Diocletian kept for himself the title of Augustus in the east and appointed Maximian as Augustus in the west. Below them, 2 Caesars, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, were designated as junior emperors, responsible for supporting the Augusti and succeeding them in the future. This structure was designed to solve 2 central problems: the defense of the borders, allowing faster military responses, and the succession, creating a system where power would be transferred in a planned manner, avoiding violent disputes. In addition to this political division, Diocletian implemented a series of deep reforms. He reorganized the frontiers, strengthened the army with new fortifications, and increased the number of soldiers. He created a stricter fiscal system based on periodic censuses and taxes calculated according to agricultural production and population. In the economic sphere, he tried to control inflation through the edict on maximum prices, which set price limits for products and services throughout the empire, although this measure had little success in the long run. He also reformed the bureaucracy, expanding and specializing the imperial administration. In the social and religious sphere, Diocletian sought to restore traditional authority and imperial unity. It was during his reign that the last and most violent persecutions of Christians took place, between 203 and 211 after Christ, in an attempt to strengthen traditional Roman religion and cultural cohesion. These measures, however, failed to eliminate Christianity, which continued to grow and attract more followers. Although the Tetrarchy worked well while Diocletian was alive, guaranteeing about 2 decades of relative stability, the system began to crumble after his voluntary abdication in 305 after Christ, an unprecedented act for a Roman emperor. Without his firm leadership, rivalries among the tetrarchs led to new civil wars, which would ultimately give rise to the rise of a single leader, Constantine, who would reunify the empire. The reforms of Diocletian, however, had a lasting impact. He was responsible for saving Rome from imminent collapse, creating an administrative model that allowed the empire to survive for more than a century in the west and for more than 1,000 years in the east. His name became associated with the idea of reorganization and survival, even in the face of the deepest crises. After Diocletian's abdication in 305 after Christ, the Tetrarchy system quickly began to disintegrate. Instead of ensuring peaceful successions, increasingly violent rivalries arose between Augusti and Caesars. In this chaotic context, one of the most capable and ambitious generals of the time, Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus, began to stand out. Through a series of military campaigns and strategic alliances, he gradually eliminated his rivals until he consolidated his power as the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire. The decisive moment in Constantine's rise was the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge, fought on October 28th of the year 312 after Christ, against Maxentius, his main rival in the west. Before the battle, according to ancient sources, Constantine reportedly had a vision or dream in which he saw a shining cross accompanied by the phrase, "With this sign you will conquer." Inspired by this vision, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. Constantine's victory was overwhelming. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River during the retreat, and Rome opened its gates to the new victor. This episode became a turning point, because from that moment on, Constantine openly favored the Christians, forever changing the empire's relationship with this religion. In 313 after Christ, just a year after the victory, Constantine and Licinius, his ally in the east, issued the Edict of Milan, which established religious freedom throughout the empire, ending official persecutions of Christians. This decision allowed the church to grow openly and become, within a few decades, one of the most powerful institutions in the Roman world. Over time, Constantine drew increasingly closer to the Christian faith, although he maintained pagan symbols in many of his policies, governing as a mediator between ancient traditions and the new religion. In addition to his religious reforms, Constantine carried out a profound transformation of the empire's political axis. Recognizing that Rome was no longer the ideal strategic center, he decided to found a new capital in the east, in a privileged position between Europe and Asia. In 330 after Christ, he inaugurated Constantinople, built on the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. The new capital was designed with massive walls, palaces, churches, and forums, and quickly became the heart of the Eastern Empire, with a geographical position ideal for controlling trade and military routes. Constantine's government brought stability to an empire that had come from nearly a century of crises. He reorganized the administration, reformed the monetary system by creating the solid gold coin called the solidus, reinforced the borders, and strengthened the army's role. At the same time, his alignment with Christianity transformed the cultural and religious landscape, laying the foundations for the future Christianization of the Roman state. After his death in 337 after Christ, Constantine was remembered as the first Christian emperor and as the founder of a new capital that, under the name Constantinople, would survive for over 1,000 years, even after the fall of Rome in the west. With Constantine's rise to absolute power and the Edict of Milan in 313 after Christ, Christianity ceased to be persecuted and was granted freedom of worship. This transformation was a watershed moment in the history of Rome, because for the first time the Christian religion, which until then had been regarded as subversive, became tolerated and gradually supported by the state. During his reign, Constantine not only guaranteed safety for Christians, but also began integrating them into the political and cultural structure of the empire. This rapprochement profoundly changed the identity of Rome, until then deeply tied to traditional cults and pagan religion. The most important milestone in this new relationship between state and church was the Council of Nicaea, held in the year 325 after Christ, in the city of Nicaea in Asia Minor. Constantine summoned bishops from all the provinces of the empire to resolve internal disputes that were fragmenting the Christian community, especially the Arian controversy, which questioned the divine nature of Christ. The emperor, realizing that these divisions could harm religious and political stability, sought to establish a doctrinal unity that would serve as a foundation for the Christian church. The council gathered more than 300 bishops and resulted in a historic decision, the formulation of the Nicene Creed, an official declaration that affirmed the full divinity of Christ and rejected Arian ideas. In addition, the council set rules for the organization of the church, defined common dates for the celebration of Easter, and reinforced the concept of ecclesiastical hierarchy. Although Constantine did not receive baptism until his deathbed, his involvement in this process made it clear that from this moment on, Christianity was becoming a pillar of the Roman state. Imperial support gave the church growing power. Christian temples began to be built in major cities, ecclesiastical leaders gained political influence and privileges, and Christian symbols, such as the cross, became associated with imperial authority. This alliance brought internal stability and a new sense of identity to Rome, but also generated tension with those who remained faithful to ancient pagan traditions, which were gradually pushed aside. The Council of Nicaea marked the beginning of a new era in which Christianity ceased to be marginal and became the center of a spiritual and political structure that would change the history of Western civilization forever. From that moment on, Rome was no longer merely the capital of a conquering empire, but the center of a new worldview, in which imperial power and Christian faith became increasingly intertwined. After Constantine's death in 337 after Christ, the Roman Empire once again faced the challenge of managing a vast territory, with borders constantly pressured by invasions and regions that were culturally and economically very different from each other. Constantine's sons attempted to rule together, but conflicts among them led to a practical division of power. This process, which began as a temporary arrangement, gradually became consolidated throughout the 4th century after Christ, resulting in an empire that, although still officially united, functioned increasingly as two distinct administrations, the West and the East. Geographic and strategic factors were decisive for this division. Constantinople, founded by Constantine on the site of ancient Byzantium, had become a key political and economic center, located between Europe and Asia, controlling access between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. The new capital allowed for faster reactions to threats in the east and pressures coming from the Persian frontier. Rome, although still symbolic, no longer held the same practical relevance. The heart of Western power gradually shifted to cities like Milan and Ravenna, closer to the conflict zones in Gaul and Germania. By the end of the 4th century, administrative division became clearer under the rule of Theodosius the Great. When he died in the year 395 after Christ, it was decided that the empire would be permanently split between his two sons. Honorius took the western part, and Arcadius took the eastern part. This division was not only territorial, but also cultural. In the east, the Greek language and a wealthier, more urbanized life predominated, while in the west, Latin remained, along with a greater dependence on rural estates and the senatorial elites. The east, more protected, wealthier, and centered on Constantinople, became more stable and able to withstand external pressures. The west, more vulnerable to Germanic invasions and economically weakened, entered a process of progressive decline. This division, although initially seen as a practical way to govern, ended up being decisive. It laid the foundations for two distinct worlds with different trajectories, which would culminate in the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ, while the East would survive as the Byzantine Empire for more than 1,000 years. This division was a response to the difficulties of governing such a vast empire, but also a clear sign that Roman unity, so painstakingly built since the time of the Republic, was no longer sustainable. At the beginning of the 5th century after Christ, the situation of the Western Roman Empire became desperate. Pressures on the frontiers increased in an overwhelming way, and what had once been allied or restrained peoples broke through the barriers and advanced deep into Roman territory. These populations, whom the Romans generically called barbarians, included the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Suebi, Huns, and other Germanic and nomadic peoples seeking new lands, security, and wealth. Among the causes of these invasions were the pressure exerted by the Huns from the Asian steppes, which pushed other tribes into the empire, and the political and economic fragility of Rome. The most striking episode of this period was the sack of Rome in 410 after Christ, led by Alaric, king of the Visigoths. After years of tension, failed negotiations, and unfulfilled promises, Alaric led his people to the very capital of the empire. In an action that would have seemed unthinkable centuries before, Rome, the city that for almost 800 years had not been taken by any foreign enemy, saw its walls breached. For 3 days the Visigoths plundered the city, carrying away gold, silver, and precious goods, while many inhabitants were killed or taken captive. Although the destruction was not total, and the main temples and churches were spared, the psychological impact of this event was devastating. The sack of 410 symbolized for the Romans the end of their capital's invulnerability, and was interpreted by many contemporaries as a sign that the empire had lost the protection of the old gods. For Christians, however, The event strengthened the notion that the earthly world was fragile, and that true security lay in faith. St. Augustine, who lived through this period, wrote the monumental work The City of God, reflecting on the collapse of temporal power in the face of divine eternity. The barbarian invasions did not cease after this episode. On the contrary, they opened a cycle of attacks and occupations in various provinces. Germanic groups settled in Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa, often under formal agreements with the Roman government, which no longer had the strength to expel them. The sack of Rome by Alaric was only the prelude to a long process of fragmentation that would intensify in the following decades, leading the West into a state of progressive ruin. Rome would survive politically for a few more decades, but the image of invincibility it had built over centuries would never again be recovered. In the 5th century after Christ, when the Western Roman Empire was already weakened and devastated by Germanic invasions, a new threat arose that terrified both the West and the East: the Huns. This nomadic people, originating from the steppes of Central Asia, possessed unmatched skill in mounted combat, using extremely powerful short bows while riding at high speed. Their mobility and violence were so great that they caused a chain reaction of migration. The Germanic tribes fled from them, while at the same time pressing against Roman frontiers. At the center of this storm appeared a legendary and feared figure, Attila, called the Scourge of God. Attila assumed command of the Huns around 434 after Christ, ruling together with his brother Bleda, and, after Bleda's death, alone. Under his leadership, the Huns became the greatest military force of their time. He imposed heavy tributes on the Eastern Roman Empire and repeatedly invaded its territories in the Balkans. Constantine and then Constantinople managed to stop his assaults only by paying enormous amounts of gold. Attila took advantage of Roman political weaknesses and the conflicts between the two empires to increase his influence. In 450 after Christ, Attila turned his forces toward the west. With an army composed not only of Huns but also of subject peoples, he crossed Gaul, modern France, and caused unprecedented devastation. It was in this context that the famous Battle of the Catalonian Plains took place, in 451 after Christ, where a coalition formed by Romans under General Aetius and their Visigothic allies managed to halt the advance of the Huns. Although it was not a decisive defeat for Attila, the battle represented the limit of his expansion to the west. The following year, in 452 after Christ, Attila turned to Italy and marched toward Rome, devastating cities along the way. The city was defenseless, and it seemed that another sack was inevitable. At this moment, Pope Leo I went out to meet the Hunnic leader, and in an encounter surrounded by mystery and negotiation, convinced Attila to withdraw. The reasons for this decision are still debated by historians. Some believe that factors such as famine, disease, and logistical problems weighed more heavily, while others emphasized the symbolic power of this embassy. Attila died unexpectedly in 453 after Christ, shortly after this campaign. His death led to the fragmentation of Hunnic power, which quickly lost importance in European politics. However, his figure remained forever as the terror that shook the last defenses of the Western Roman Empire. The Hunnic invasions not only devastated cities, but accelerated the process of Rome's fall by completely disorganizing its defenses and pushing other peoples into its borders. After decades of invasions, political crises, and internal weakening, the 5th century after Christ witnessed the definitive collapse of the Western Roman Empire. What had once been the most feared and organized power in the world had become a mosaic of devastated provinces, powerless local governors, and an army increasingly dependent on barbarian mercenaries. Successive waves of invaders, Visigoths, Vandals, Suebi, Huns, Ostrogoths, disintegrated Roman control. At the same time, the central authority in Rome had lost all strength. Emperors were appointed and deposed by their own troops, reduced to mere decorative figures with no real power. In 476 after Christ, this long process reached its final point. The Germanic general Odoacer, leader of the Heruli, deposed the young Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the West. Without resistance, Romulus was spared and exiled, while Odoacer sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, declaring himself king of Italy under the nominal authority of the Eastern emperor. This gesture, more symbolic than violent, marked the end of the imperial institution in the West. Rome, which for centuries had been the center of a global empire, ceased to exist as an autonomous political power. In practice, the empire had ceased to function long before this date. The western provinces were dominated by independent Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths controlled Hispania and part of Gaul. The Vandals had established a kingdom in North Africa, and other peoples had settled in various regions. The economy was in ruins, cities were depopulated, and the roads unsafe. The Western Roman army was no longer Roman. It was made up of barbarian contingents that frequently turned against those they were supposed to protect. With the fall of the West, only the Eastern Roman Empire remained, later known as the Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople. Richer, more urbanized and better defended, the East preserved Roman heritage for almost 1,000 years after the loss of Rome, keeping alive its institutions, its culture, and to some extent its military power. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ was not a single abrupt event, but the conclusion of a long and painful process of fragmentation. Even so, its symbolic date became a turning point. With it, Antiquity ends and the Middle Ages begin in Europe. Rome, however, did not disappear completely. Its legacy, expressed in law, language, architecture, engineering, religion, and culture, would continue to shape Western civilization for centuries. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ, the center of Roman power shifted definitively to Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire, which would later be known as the Byzantine Empire, became the guardian of the political, military, cultural, and religious heritage of Rome. Unlike the West, the East had richer cities, more active trade, stronger frontiers, and a capital that was both a fortress and a commercial hub between Europe and Asia. This allowed it not only to survive, but to flourish for nearly 1,000 years after the Western collapse. Constantinople, founded by Constantine, became the most powerful city in the world. Protected by almost impregnable walls and benefiting from its strategic location, it was a center of culture, religion, and wealth. The Greek language became predominant, and with it, a synthesis of Roman and Hellenistic elements shaped a new imperial identity. Even after the emperor disappeared in Rome, the emperor in Constantinople continued to consider himself the legitimate emperor of the Romans, keeping alive the laws and administrative structure inherited from Augustus and Diocletian. During the first centuries after the fall of the West, the Byzantine Empire was governed by emperors capable of restoring and consolidating territory. Among them, Justinian stands out, who in the 6th century after Christ conducted campaigns to reconquer former Western provinces, such as North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. Justinian also left an immortal legacy with the compilation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, a set of laws that preserved Roman law and served as the basis for European legal systems for centuries. In addition, he built the majestic Hagia Sophia, one of the greatest architectural works in history, symbolizing the union of faith and power. While the West sank into fragmented kingdoms and the transition to the feudal Middle Ages, the Byzantine Empire continued to be a beacon of knowledge, art, and diplomacy. Its scholars preserved classical texts from Greece and Rome, transmitting them centuries later to medieval Europe. Byzantine trade connected Europe, Asia, and Africa, ensuring wealth and influence. However, the empire also faced enormous challenges: Persian, Arab, Slavic, Bulgar, and Turkic attacks, as well as internal religious divisions, such as the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Even with all these difficulties, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to represent the continuity of Roman tradition. While in the West the fall of Rome marked the beginning of the Middle Ages, in the East it inaugurated a new stage, that of the Byzantine Empire, which would keep the Roman legacy alive for centuries until the final fall of Constantinople in 1453 after Christ. This prolonged survival was proof that, even destroyed in the West, Rome never completely disappeared. It merely changed in form and center. The political fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ did not mean the disappearance of Rome. On the contrary, its influence continued and deeply shaped Western civilization. Rome left humanity a legacy that endured through the centuries, encompassing law, urban planning, engineering, culture, and language. These elements formed the foundations of much of the modern world. Roman law is perhaps the most enduring of these contributions. Since the Republic, Rome developed a legal system based on written laws, courts, and concepts such as property, contracts, citizenship, and legal equality, at least for those who had the status of citizens. During the imperial period, these laws were organized into codes that centuries later would inspire Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis in the Eastern Roman Empire. This body of law became the basis of civil law in almost all of medieval and modern Europe, and its principles are still visible today in constitutions and civil codes. In engineering and architecture, the Romans revolutionized the ancient world. They were masters at building roads, aqueducts, bridges, and amphitheaters, structures designed to last centuries. Many of these constructions have survived to this day, a testimony to the technical skill that made the integration of a vast territory possible. Roman concrete, the techniques of vaults and arches, and the urban organization that included forums, public baths, and sewer systems turned cities into efficient and livable centers. Works such as the Colosseum, the aqueducts, and the roads that crossed the empire remained as models for future generations. Culturally, Rome left a literary and philosophical legacy that continued to be studied and copied throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Authors such as Cicero, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Seneca, and Tacitus influenced rhetoric, politics, and moral thought in the Western world. In addition, the integration of cultures within the empire allowed a fusion between Greek heritage and Roman traditions, creating an environment that valued knowledge and art. Rome also played a central role in the spread of Christianity, which was born in its eastern provinces and in the 4th century after Christ became the official religion of the state, shaping the course of Europe's religious history. Finally, the Latin language, the official language of Rome, spread across all the western provinces. Over time, it evolved into the so-called Romance languages, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanian, and deeply influenced the technical, legal, and scientific vocabulary of many other languages, including English. Even after the fragmentation of the empire, Latin remained the learned language of the church, diplomacy, and scholarship for over 1,000 years. Thus, the Roman legacy survived far beyond its military and political power. Its conception of law, infrastructure, administrative organization, culture, and language continued to form the backbone of the Western world, ensuring that Rome, even defeated as an empire, would never be forgotten. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ, the heritage of Rome did not disappear. During the Middle Ages, Roman ideas, symbols, and traditions continued to exert a strong influence over kings, popes, and Germanic peoples who occupied the former provinces of the empire. This desire to restore, in some measure, the glory of Rome ended up crystallizing in a new political project, the rise of the Holy Roman Empire in the 10th century after Christ. In the early medieval centuries, Rome remained more a religious than a political symbol, as the seat of the papacy and the heart of the Christian Church in the West. At the same time, several barbarian kingdoms sought legitimacy by associating themselves with the memory of the ancient empire. The most striking case was that of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, who in the year 800 after Christ was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III in Rome. With this coronation, the Pope symbolically restored imperial dignity in the West, linking Christian power to Roman tradition. Thus was born the idea of a rebirth of the empire. This imperial title would later pass, after the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire, to the German kings. In 962 after Christ, Otto I, king of Germania, was crowned emperor by Pope John V. This act officially gave rise to the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that claimed to be the continuation of the Roman legacy in the West, now in a Christian and Germanic form. Although its practical authority varied greatly and depended on alliances between the papacy and the nobility, the imperial title remained for centuries as a powerful symbol of Christian unity and Roman tradition. The Holy Roman Empire was not a recreation of the ancient empire of Augustus or Trajan. It was a feudal, decentralized structure made up of various Germanic kingdoms and principalities, but with an imperial crown that sought to preserve the idea of a universal Christian empire. The very choice of the name Roman aimed to legitimize this institution as heir to the power and greatness of Rome. This link to the Roman imperial tradition survived for almost 1,000 years until its dissolution in 1806 after Christ. This medieval revival of the Roman idea showed how the legacy of the empire continued to shape European politics. Even after centuries of its fall, Rome was still seen as the model of authority and order to be imitated. Thus, in the Middle Ages, the dream of Rome did not die. It was reinterpreted, adapted, and used as the foundation for a new form of empire. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ, Rome continued to be the foundation upon which medieval Europe was built. The collapse of central authority did not mean the disappearance of Roman culture, law, and infrastructure. On the contrary, they became the basis of a new order. Latin remained the language of the church, diplomacy, and learning, uniting different peoples through a common tongue. Roman administrative organization influenced the structure of the Germanic kingdoms that emerged, and the cities, roads, and agricultural systems inherited from the empire served as the framework for the development of medieval societies. Christianity, consolidated as the official religion in the final centuries of the empire, was the great link of continuity between the Roman world and the Middle Ages. The Church inherited not only spiritual authority, but also Roman administrative and legal practices. Monasteries and cathedrals became centers for preserving knowledge, copying ancient manuscripts, including texts by Roman and Greek authors. This work was essential to ensure that classical science, philosophy, and literature would reach the Renaissance. Roman law, especially through the Corpus Juris Civilis compiled by Justinian in Constantinople, had a profound influence on the formation of medieval laws and, later, on modern European law. Concepts such as citizenship, property, contracts, and jurisdiction originated in Rome and remained at the core of legal thought for centuries. The idea of a structured state, with central authority and codified laws, inspired both medieval monarchies and modern states. In architecture and engineering, Roman legacies were equally enduring. Bridges, roads, aqueducts, and irrigation systems built by the Romans continued to be used throughout the Middle Ages. Knowledge of arches, domes, and Roman construction techniques was recovered and further developed during the Renaissance, producing works directly inspired by the grandeur of Rome. In the modern world, Rome's influence can be seen in languages, the Romance languages, and the massive presence of Latin-derived words in English, in republican systems of government that revive Roman concepts of citizenship and representation, in urban organization, and in legal institutions. Even in politics, the very ideas of a Senate, republic, and civil code have their roots in the Roman experience. Rome was not just a military empire. It was a civilization that transmitted a lasting structure of values, laws, and knowledge. By shaping the Middle Ages and providing the cultural and institutional foundations for the Renaissance, Rome built a legacy that still lives in the foundations of the modern world. For this reason, one can say that in essence Rome never completely fell. It transformed into the invisible foundation of Western civilization, even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ and, many centuries later, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 after Christ. Rome continued to live on in memory, institutions, and human culture. The reason for this lies in the fact that Rome, more than a city or an empire, became a concept, the idea of order, civilization, power, and eternity. For this reason, the so-called eternal city never disappeared. For 2,000 years, Rome has survived in politics, religion, law, architecture, language, and in the collective mentality of the West. The myth of Rome was built on several pillars. The first is cultural and legal heritage. Roman laws shaped the foundations of modern law, and the Latin language remains alive in the Romance languages and in science. The second is religious heritage. From the moment it became the center of Western Christianity, Rome became the spiritual seat of millions. Even after the fall of political power, the Pope continued to exercise global influence from that city. Rome became synonymous with faith and moral authority. Another pillar of the Roman myth is its extraordinary capacity for adaptation. The political and cultural forms of Rome were imitated in different periods. Medieval and Renaissance emperors tried to recreate the Roman Empire. Universities rediscovered classical texts during the Renaissance. And even today, modern states draw inspiration from institutions created in ancient Rome. Even the idea of Western civilization is, in large part, a continuation of this legacy. That is why it is often said that Rome never died. Even when it lost territories, wealth, or military power, it remained alive as a model and inspiration. It exists in modern cities with their forums turned into squares, in the laws that govern entire societies, in roads that still follow ancient paths, in languages that carry centuries of history, and in political and philosophical ideas that continue to influence the world. The Eternal City is a symbol of permanence amid change. Throughout history, empires have risen and fallen, but Rome left a mark so deep that, in a way, it continues to live on in everything that was built after it. For this reason, even after its political fall, Rome remains eternal in the memory of humanity. The history of Rome is the most impressive narrative of rise, glory, and transformation ever seen in human history. From its humble origins as a small village on the banks of the Tiber River to becoming an empire that dominated almost the entire known world, Rome traveled a path marked by wars, ambition, political and cultural genius, crises, falls, and rebirths. No other civilization has managed to exert such a profound and lasting influence on so many areas of human life. In its early centuries, Rome grew supported by its legions, by a discipline that seemed invincible, and by a sense of destiny that pushed its citizens toward ever bolder conquests. During the Republican period, it created institutions that valued law, political organization, and civic participation even if limited, and it was precisely this system that forged the strength that defeated giant enemies such as Carthage and Alexander. Then, in the transition to the empire, Rome witnessed the rise of figures who became immortal: Julius Caesar, who dared to break with traditions; Augustus, who built a system capable of providing stability for centuries; and so many other emperors, from Trajan to Marcus Aurelius, who each in their own way shaped the greatness of a state that seemed endless. But Rome was not only war and conquest, it was culture, engineering, art, and law. It built roads that crossed continents, aqueducts that brought water to cities previously unthinkable, amphitheaters and forums that became the centers of social life. It created a legal system that structured human coexistence, gave form to a language that spread throughout the world, and established the idea of citizenship and a centralized state. At its height, Rome was the center of a political and economic system that connected peoples from Britannia to Egypt, from Hispania to Mesopotamia. The empire, however, also revealed the fragility of human power: internal crises, corruption, civil wars, invasions, and the very inability of a single center of power to control such a vast world. The fall of the West in 476 after Christ marked the end of an era, but not the end of Rome. In the East, Constantinople kept the Roman flame alive for another 1,000 years, and even when the Byzantine walls fell in 1453 after Christ, Rome still lived on in law, in the church, in languages, and in the Western mentality. More than an empire, Rome became a concept, an ideal of order, of power, and of civilization. Its symbols and values were revived by medieval kings, modern emperors, and even contemporary nations. The very notion of Europe, of the West, and of the rule of law was born in its streets, in its armies, and in its forums. Rome continues to exist in our cities, in our laws, in our culture, and in our languages. For all these reasons, Rome never died. In every stone of its ruins, in every word derived from Latin, in every concept of justice and citizenship, it remains present, silent, and eternal. What began as a village and became an empire now lives on as a legacy that shaped the world, a legacy that will never be forgotten. Imagine closing your eyes and crossing more than 2,000 years of history. The first sound you hear is the gentle murmur of the Tiber River, flowing past an insignificant village made of mud huts. Few would have believed that this cluster of houses would one day become the heart of the most powerful civilization of antiquity. But that village was called Rome. Over the hours you have spent with us, we have witnessed the birth and the rise of an empire that not only conquered lands, but also shaped ideas. Rome defeated gigantic enemies, endured civil wars, saw ambitious men tear down and rebuild its institutions, and knew legendary emperors, philosophers, generals, and also rulers consumed by madness. We have seen its peak, its victories, and the scars that slowly led it to collapse. This journey did not tell only of battles and dates. It told the story of how a city became an idea. Rome left behind a legacy that survived its ruins, laws that still organize societies today, a language that echoes across half the world, aqueducts, roads, theaters, legal codes, and modern cities that still follow its design. Even when the legions scattered, when barbarians crossed its borders, and the power of the West faded away, Rome did not die. It merely changed its form. It survived in the East for another 1,000 years and lived on in books, churches, universities, and in the collective imagination. Rome is not only a place of the past, it has become the silent foundation on which the modern world was built. So, before sleep arrives and the silence of the night covers everything, remember that while time erases empires, memory builds eternities, and no eternity has been as persistent as that of the eternal city. This is the story of Rome, and in a way it is still ours. Now that the last page of this long journey has been turned, you may feel as if you have walked through entire centuries. Rome was born small, grew indomitable, shone brighter than any other civilization, and, like everything in human history, one day dissolved. But throughout these 6 hours, it has become clear that the political end of Rome never meant the end of Rome. As you take a deep breath and let yourself be embraced by the silence of the night, think about everything this city has left behind. The roads that still guide paths, the aqueducts that defied drought, the laws that taught us how to live together, the language that turned sound into culture. Rome was never only stone, marble, or legions. Rome was and still is an idea, a method, and a dream. Time may have erased its walls, but it has not erased its mark. Rome lives within us every time we speak a word inherited from Latin, every time we look at a building with columns and arches, every time we think of justice, of citizenship, and of what it means to be part of something greater. And so, as sleep comes and the night advances in silence, close your eyes for a moment. Somewhere, under the stars, the ancient streets of Rome still echo, and that echo is eternal.